Hello there, and welcome to Secretum Histories, where curiosity drifts gently between myth and meaning, and the distant echoes of the past make their way softly into the present. Tonight's quiet exploration begins far from the warmth of familiar lands. It begins where the air grows thin, the compass hesitates, and the maps begin to curl at the edges. This is where the ancients said the world ended, or perhaps where something older began. A place once called Hyperborea, a name that meant beyond the north wind. Before we begin wandering toward that frozen horizon, I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. Maybe your own evening is cold enough to see your breath, or maybe it's one of those warm nights when the sky feels endless and you can't imagine snow ever falling again. Either way, I'm grateful you've chosen to join this little expedition into legend. If you find this gentle unravelling of forgotten worlds soothing, enlightening, or just a calm way to wind down, a like or a quiet subscription would help this cosy corner reach others who might be looking for something peaceful too. So, find your own stillness, settle back, and let your mind drift northward, past the forests, past the mountains, into the white silence where history and myth blur into one another like snow under moonlight. There, somewhere between fact and dream, lies the story of Hyperborea. It began as a whisper in Greek imagination, a word that felt more like a spell than a destination. The Greeks, for all their precision and love of geometry, were never immune to wonder. To them, the world beyond their known seas was a theatre of marvels, and in the farthest reaches of that mental map past Thrace and the roaring home of Boreas, the god of the north wind, there was said to be a land untouched by sorrow, untouched even by winter itself. A place of radiant sunlight, eternal spring, and people so peaceful and long-lived that the gods themselves envied their quiet joy. To live beyond Boreas was to live beyond the reach of suffering. The Hyperboreans, so the poet said, knew neither war nor disease. Their days were measured not in toil but in music, dance and worship. They dined on fruits and fragrant herbs, they laughed easily, and when they tired of living they simply vanished into air or transformed into birds. The myths made them sound less like mortals, and more like the memory of a time before humanity forgot how to be content. In a way, Hyperborea was never meant to be found. It was meant to be felt, a compass pointing toward an ideal rather than a coordinate. But of course, humans being what we are, someone eventually tried to find it anyway. The desire to map paradise is older than reason. The earlier stories of Hyperborea reached back to Hesiod and Pindar, then echoed through Herodotus and beyond. Each retelling added new colour, a new clue, a new argument for where this perfect land might have been hiding. To the poet Pindar, Hyperborea was a place of divine festivals where Apollo himself spent his winters. When he left Delphi, he didn't vanish into the sea or sky. He went home to the Hyperboreans. In that vision, the god of light needed to return to the source of his brightness. This alone tells us what Hyperborea really represented to the Greek mind. A northern heaven, a reflection of balance and immortality, a counterweight to the mortal world's chaos. But the Greeks weren't naive dreamers. They were sailors, traders, and mathematicians. Even in myth, they liked to measure things. So they tried to trace this shimmering world on a map. To some, it lay somewhere near the far reaches of Scythia, perhaps beyond the lands of the horsemen who lived near the Black Sea. Others pushed it farther still, past the Caucasus, beyond the unknown rivers, until it rested near the Arctic itself. Wherever it was, it sat at the very edge of imagination, where the horizon blurred into the sky. As the centuries turned, the story of Hyperborea evolved with geography. When real explorers reached new frontiers, myth followed in their wake. When traders returned with strange tales of lands where the sun barely set, the Greeks nodded knowingly. Hyperborea, they would say, must be there. And perhaps in a way it was, because the Arctic, for all its frozen stillness, has always held a strange kind of light. During the summer months, the sun barely dips below the horizon. day becomes a long, luminous twilight. The air itself seems to hum. To an ancient mind, it would feel like a place touched by eternity. And from such light, it's easy to imagine a people who never grew old, who never suffered the indignities of mortal decay. The geography invited the myth, and the myth returned the favour by making geography magical. It's worth remembering that to ancient peoples the North was not only mysterious, it was sacred. It represented the axis of the world, the cosmic hinge around which the heavens turned. The Greeks believed in a celestial pole, and Hyperborea lay close to it. To travel there, even in thought, was to approach the divine machinery of creation. So when they spoke of Hyperborea, they weren't just describing a hidden country. They were pointing to the origin of order, the still point in the turning universe where time moved differently. This association between the North and transcendence would outlive the Greeks by millennia. Later, in Norse myth, we'd find echoes of it in Asgard's shimmering halls and the Bifrost Bridge, glowing like an aurora across the sky. Even further east, ancient Hindu cosmology spoke of Mount Meru, a cosmic mountain around which all existence revolved. The pattern repeats because the symbolism is universal. Every culture looks towards some shining northern height, a place beyond reach yet deeply familiar, where the line between heaven and earth softens. Hyperborea was simply the Greek version of that longing, but myths have a habit of clinging to history like frost on stone. Once the idea of Hyperborea took hold, it began to attract everything mysterious and unexplained. When Greek travellers returned with tales of golden-haired tribes in the far north, the poets nodded. Hyperboreans, surely. When strange objects washed ashore from distant seas, they became relics from that hidden paradise. Even the cold winds that swept down from the Arctic were said to be the breath of Boreas himself, rushing past the borders of the blessed land. Over time, this myth of the perfect North found new audiences. Roman geographers like Pomponius Mela and Pliny the Elder included references to Hyperborea in their accounts of the world. They wrote of its perpetual sunshine and gentle climate, of its people living in harmony with nature and the gods. These weren't wild imaginings for them. They were reports, as credible as any story of elephants in India or spices from Arabia. Ancient geography was a tapestry woven from both observation and wonder, and Hyperborea was its brightest thread. The Middle Ages inherited that thread and wove it into new shapes. As Christian Europe began mapping the world anew, ancient names lingered like ghosts on parchment. Cartographers, cautious but curious, sometimes placed Hyperborea near the Arctic Circle or along the edges of Greenland, unsure whether it was a mythic island or a misremembered landmass. The name became shorthand for mystery itself, a symbol of the unreachable north where saints, spirits, and lost civilizations might dwell. It's tempting to think of these beliefs as quaint, but they were part of a long continuum of human imagination. Every age has its Hyperborea, its hidden land that promises to explain everything if only we could reach it. In the 19th century, explorers searched for the source of the Nile. In the 20th, they dreamed of Atlantis and Mu. Today, we look for lost knowledge in genetic data and forgotten ruins under ice. The methods change, but the yearning remains the same. If Hyperborea feels different, it's because its mystery lies not beneath the ocean but above the world, wrapped in cold light. It wasn't drowned. It was hidden in plain sight, behind the shimmer of the aurora. The ancients believed the Hyperboreans lived in perfect alignment with nature, guided by celestial rhythms rather than clocks. They didn't build empires or carve monuments. Their harmony was their legacy. Some even said they were the ancestors of all wisdom, the teachers of early humanity who retreated northward when the world grew noisy and cruel. That image of a vanished civilization of light would become irresistible to mystics and philosophers centuries later. But before the mystics claimed it, Hyperborea belonged to poets. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, admitted he had never met anyone who had seen it, but he also refused to dismiss it entirely. He reported that offerings were said to travel from Hyperborea, passed hand to hand through northern tribes until they reached Greece. The journey of these sacred gifts, feathers, amber, mysterious symbols, link the mythic north to the heart of Greek religion. Even if the land itself remained unseen, its presence was felt through ritual. That faint trail of myth and memory would keep the legend alive long after the old gods had faded. Centuries later, Renaissance scholars poring over ancient texts stumbled upon the name again. They found Hyperborea mentioned alongside Atlantis, Thule, and the Isles of the Blessed. It fit neatly into a worldview that believed the world was older, wiser, and stranger than the present allowed. If civilization could fall, then surely it could have risen before. Hyperborea became a cipher for lost perfection, a golden age preserved in frost. And perhaps that's why the story continues to pull at us. Because beneath the geography and the speculation lies something profoundly human. The sense that we once lived closer to balance, closer to the divine. The longing for that imagined harmony gives the legend its staying power. The details may shift, the maps may be redrawn, but the feeling remains constant. Somewhere far away, untouched by time or tragedy, there is still a place where the world is as it was meant to be. That idea has a kind of quiet comfort. It softens the edges of history. It reminds us that even in the harshest landscapes, imagination can bloom. And as the northern lights ripple across the sky like slow music, it's easy to see why generations of dreamers kept returning to that frozen horizon, convinced that something extraordinary lay just beyond it. The whisper of Hyperborea has never really gone silent. It lingers in old maps, in poetry, in the names of Arctic winds. It appears whenever someone looks north and wonders what might have been. The Greeks may have invented the word, but the yearning it describes belongs to all of us. The search for a place untouched by decay, where knowledge is pure and life unfolds without fear. In the quiet between myth and memory, that search begins. And if you listen carefully past the static of history and the hum of the modern world, you can still hear it, the faint, unending call of the forgotten north. And somewhere beyond that horizon, the story continues, shifting from myth to map, from poetry to parchment, as humankind begins the long attempt to draw the impossible. When people began to draw the world, they weren't just making geography. They were drawing their understanding of existence itself. Every coastline, every mountain, every stretch of sea represented not only what was known, but what could be imagined. A map was both mirror and dream, and somewhere on the edge of that dream, usually in the blank spaces where ink met mystery, the name Hyperborea appeared. In the earliest centuries of cartography, a map was less a record of land than an argument with uncertainty. The Greeks traced the outlines of the Mediterranean like a comfort zone, a world they could sail and measure. Beyond that ring of familiarity, the parchment became a theatre for wonder. Creatures were drawn where none had been seen. Mountains rose where rumour suggested height, and lands shimmered in imagination long before anyone could reach them. The further one travelled from Greece, the less reality obeyed its usual rules. In those upper margins of possibility, Hyperborea found its home. One of the earliest references that hinted at its placement came from Hecataeus of Miletus, a geographer of the 6th century BCE. Though his maps are lost, later sources tell us he believed the known world to be surrounded by Oceanus, a vast river encircling the continents. Beyond the lands of the Scythians, north of Thrace and the Black Sea, the realm of Boreas began. That invisible wind god's domain became a kind of threshold, the last boundary before paradise. Beyond him, past the biting air and the barren ice, lay the land of eternal sunlight. The Greeks placed Hyperborea there, at the top of the world, not as an afterthought, but as a crown. When Herodotus wrote about the world 2 centuries later, he included Hyperborea cautiously, as though acknowledging an old friend he couldn't quite vouch for. He noted that no one he met had travelled so far, but stories persisted of gifts sent from that land. Offerings, wrapped in mysterious materials, supposedly passed from tribe to tribe, moving slowly southward until they reached the island of Delos, sacred to Apollo. Whether the offerings were real or symbolic didn't matter. What mattered was the connection. For the Greeks, the Hyperboreans were not only physically distant, they were spiritually adjacent. They existed on the same map of belief, even if the cartography of the real world couldn't yet contain them. As later thinkers tried to visualize the Earth in more mathematical terms, Hyperborea's placement shifted but never disappeared. The philosopher Pythagoras and his followers imagined a spherical world long before the idea was fashionable. If the world was a sphere, then it needed poles, axes, balance. The north was no longer a blur of wind and snow. It became geometry, symmetry, a region with cosmic purpose. Hyperborea found a more structured location there, sitting near the celestial axis, a polar garden under a sun that never set. By the time of Eratosthenes in the 3rd century BCE, maps had grown more precise. The Earth had measurable circumference, longitude and latitude, but precision didn't erase wonder, it only framed it more elegantly. Even as Greek geographers defined the known, they left the unknown deliberately open. Their maps often ended with the phrase terra incognita, the land not known, as though knowledge itself had a border that demanded respect. In those quiet spaces, beyond measurable rivers and cities, Hyperborea lingered, patient as an idea that refused extinction. When the Roman world inherited Greek geography, it inherited its imagination too. Roman maps, more administrative in spirit, still kept pockets of mystery where poetry could breathe. Pomponius Mela, writing in the 1st century CE, described the Hyperboreans as living beyond the north wind, under skies of constant light, in a land so pure and mild that they knew no illness or old age. To him, this wasn't superstition, it was testimony. Ancient travellers had spoken of nights that never darkened, of seasons that blurred together, of people with complexions so pale they seemed lit from within. These reports, probably inspired by glimpses of the far northern latitudes, folded perfectly into myth. Real observation gave the story new breath. It's easy to forget how little the ancients could verify. To them, every new horizon was both revelation and risk. The known world stopped abruptly at the limits of experience, yet within that uncertainty was freedom, the freedom to populate the void with meaning. When maps were copied by hand, when distances were calculated with shadows and strings, the northern lands could be stretched to accommodate faith. Hyperborea thrived not in accuracy but in imagination's permission. Medieval mapmakers continued that tradition, though they added their own layers of theology and folklore. To them, the earth was a sacred creation, not merely a sphere but a moral diagram. At the centre lay the Holy Land. Around it, the continents formed the petals of divine design. The far edges were reserved for symbols, dragons, angels, and remnants of a world before sin. Hyperborea often hovered near the pole, sometimes drawn as an island, sometimes as a circular continent enclosed by mountains. In certain manuscripts, it even merged with Thule, the legendary island described by Pytheas of Massalia, a Greek explorer who claimed to have sailed 6 days north of Britain around 320 BCE. Pytheas reported seeing a place where the sea became a sluggish mixture of ice and mist, where the sun barely dipped below the horizon. His contemporaries mocked him, but his description fit the Arctic too perfectly to ignore. So when later ages sought a real-world anchor for Hyperborea, Pytheas's Thule became its natural twin. By the Renaissance, this merging of myth and geography gained momentum. As explorers pushed into the unknown oceans, the margins of maps became laboratories for imagination. The Venetian cartographer Fra Mauro filled his great circular map of the world, made around 1450, with notes about fantastic lands and people. Later, in the age of Mercator and Ortelius, the poles remained mysterious blank zones, and Hyperborea found new shapes in their void. Gerardus Mercator's 1569 world map, the foundation for modern navigation, depicted the North Pole as a whirlpool surrounded by 4 great islands, divided by rivers converging toward a central magnetic mountain. Around these islands, he placed names drawn from old legends, including Hyperborea. The effect was haunting, as if myth had survived the age of reason by hiding in the geometry of latitude lines. The idea that the far north held a magnetic secret persisted for centuries. Early explorers who ventured into Arctic waters spoke of strange compass behaviour, lights that danced in the sky, and vast stretches of sea ice that seemed alive. They didn't yet know about magnetic declination, or the aurora borealis, so they described what they saw in the language of enchantment. The invisible forces of magnetism and solar wind became, in effect, modern versions of Boreas's breath. The science of navigation unintentionally revived the old myth. Some scholars in the 17th and 18th centuries took this further, proposing that Hyperborea might once have been real but lost to cataclysm. They pointed to ancient flood myths, to shifting coastlines, to the possibility of lands drowned by glacial melt. The North, with its buried fossils and strange relics, seemed an ideal candidate for forgotten civilizations. As Enlightenment rationalism grew, the myth retreated from maps but found refuge in speculation. Philosophers and mystics reinterpreted it not as a physical place, but as a symbol of primeval wisdom, a civilization of the dawn, extinguished yet lingering in human memory. What's remarkable is how consistent the imagery remained across time. From Pindar's golden plains to Mercator's polar islands, Hyperborea was always imagined as circular, radiant, protected. The circular motif mattered. In ancient cosmology, the circle represented perfection, harmony, and eternity. A circular world in the far north symbolized completion, the unreachable summit of knowledge. Many maps drew Hyperborea surrounded by mountains so high that winds could not penetrate them, as though paradise required isolation. The wind god Boreas might roar outside, but beyond him lay stillness. That stillness, perhaps, was what humanity kept searching for. In every century, the edges of the map were where restlessness and reverence met. Hyperborea was not the only mythic land to inhabit that liminal space. Atlantis lurked beneath the waves, Lemuria beneath the Indian Ocean, Shambhala somewhere in the mountains of Tibet. But Hyperborea alone carried the quietness of light. Its mythology was cold but not cruel, distant but not hostile. Even when explorers failed to find it, they couldn't quite let it go. In the 19th century, as Arctic exploration became a national obsession, echoes of Hyperborea returned in the background of more pragmatic quests. Expeditions searching for the Northwest Passage described eerie landscapes where mirages danced, and the horizon folded in strange ways. Reports of the polar mirage or looming islands gave fuel to the idea of hidden continents beneath the ice. Newspapers speculated that new lands might exist near the pole, just waiting to be discovered once the ice receded. Though couched in scientific language, the longing was the same as the ancient one, to find something unspoiled and luminous at the world's northern edge. The persistence of Hyperborea on maps, real or imagined, tells us something about how knowledge grows. We like to think of cartography as a triumph of precision, but it has always been equally a confession of ignorance. Every chart, no matter how accurate, contains an act of faith. The blank spaces, those are where imagination works hardest. And when one generation fills a blank, another invents a new horizon to replace it. Hyperborea moved from parchment to legend to metaphor, but it never disappeared. It just kept retreating a little farther north, always just beyond the reach of certainty. Even today, satellite imagery has replaced hand-drawn maps, yet the fascination lingers. The Arctic, viewed from orbit, still glows with mystery. Beneath its ice lie traces of ancient climate shifts, extinct ecosystems, and perhaps remnants of human presence older than we expect. Scientists drill ice cores that hold tiny bubbles of atmosphere from millennia past, reading time like pages in a frozen book. Each layer tells of warmth and cold, of extinction and rebirth. In a quiet way, that's the same impulse that drew Greek poets to imagine Hyperborea, the desire to read the planet's memory, to glimpse what existed before the noise of history began. The more we learn about the Arctic, the more its strangeness persists. Beneath the polar cap lies a buried ridge stretching across the ocean floor, splitting into multiple branches like veins of an ancient heart. The magnetic pole wanders unpredictably, drifting miles each year, as if restless. Aurora light flickers like curtains of living colour. Even with all our instruments, it still feels like a place that refuses full comprehension. Perhaps that's why the myth endures, because the North continues to behave like a mystery. When the ancients filled their maps with wonders, they weren't making mistakes. They were expressing curiosity in its purest form. They understood that the world isn't merely measured, it's also felt. Hyperborea was the feeling that the world held more than it revealed, that knowledge was always only partial, and that somewhere, just beyond the next boundary, perfection waited in silence. The maps that once placed Hyperborea at the top of the world are gone, but their spirit remains in every modern attempt to imagine what lies beyond what we know, whether in telescopes aimed at exoplanets or probes descending through ice on distant moons. The same pattern repeats. We draw what we understand, then stare at the edges, wondering what light shines beyond. So, as the ink of ancient cartographers fades and satellites replace parchment, the story of Hyperborea drifts quietly onward, no longer a coordinate but a concept, a symbol of the unreachable, the pure, the calm, the place every mapmaker secretly hopes to find, though none ever will. And as the ice hums under the aurora and the compass needles tremble at the roof of the world, the myth begins to move again, from maps to minds, from parchment to the pulse of imagination, carrying us toward the next part of the journey, where myth meets meaning and legend begins to ripple through the centuries that followed. The Greeks had a way of turning directions into philosophy. To them, the world wasn't simply a shape on parchment, it was a living idea arranged around balance and meaning. The East carried beginnings, the South symbolized warmth and growth, the West spoke of endings, and the North, always the North, represented mystery. It was the direction of unseen winds and unreachable heights, the place where the known world softened into something more divine, and somewhere deep in that northern imagination, bathed in sunlight that never died, lived the Hyperboreans. For ancient Greece, the world beyond its borders was never just geography. It was psychology. The North wasn't merely cold, it was sacred. The Greeks believed that beyond the roaring breath of Boreas, the god of the north wind, there existed a land that defied decay, where the gods themselves sought refuge from the noise of the mortal world. Hyperborea was not only a myth, but a reflection of longing, a mirror that showed what Greece imagined perfection might look like when stripped of conflict, hunger, and time. In the quiet minds of poets and philosophers, Hyperborea became a symbol of the impossible equilibrium between life and eternity. It wasn't just another golden age. It was the idea of a world still untouched by the fall. Where the golden age of Kronos described a past long gone, Hyperborea remained present, still alive somewhere northward, still possible. It was a myth of continuing perfection, a dream not lost, merely hidden. The earliest whispers of Hyperborea entered Greek consciousness through poetry. Hesiod's works, though fragmentary, hinted at distant peoples who lived near the edges of the world, in communion with gods, their lives longer than ordinary mortals. Pindar, that careful sculptor of words, gave the image its lasting shape. In one of his odes, he wrote of a land beyond the north wind where men lived free from disease and old age, their hearts filled with festivals and music, their days unmarked by toil. He described it as a country of radiant light, where Apollo himself retreated each year to rest after his labours among mortals. To Pindar, the north wasn't barren, it was blessed. This link between Apollo and Hyperborea became the myth's beating heart. Every winter, when the god of the sun and prophecy disappeared from Delphi, the Greek said he journeyed north to his other home, a place where the days never darkened. There, among his devoted Hyperboreans, he renewed his strength before returning south with spring. This rhythm, the departure and return of the god, mirrored the turning of the seasons, tying mythology to the slow mechanics of the natural world. Hyperborea thus became the North's secret summer, a promise of light even during the longest nights. The Greeks were not strangers to hardship. They lived in a landscape of sharp beauty and constant negotiation with nature, famine, drought, and the restless sea. In imagining Hyperborea, they created a contrast to that struggle, a dream of effortless harmony. The Hyperboreans didn't fight for crops or build walls against invaders. Their world existed in perpetual equilibrium. The sun hung low but never set. Rivers never froze nor flooded. There was music instead of battle, ceremony instead of conquest. In a sense, it was Greece's subconscious wish, a reflection of what civilization wanted to become when it forgot to fight itself. The Hyperboreans were not heroes in the Homeric mould. They had no wars, no tragedies, no jealous gods punishing their hubris. Their myth existed without conflict, and perhaps that was what made it so haunting. A world without struggle feels utopian, but also distant, as though too pure to touch. The Greeks' relationship with myth was never entirely literal. They understood that truth could live inside metaphor. When they spoke of a land of eternal light, they were not necessarily claiming a specific latitude, but describing a state of being. Yet they also listened to travellers. When sailors returned from journeys into the north, speaking of long days where the sun barely dipped below the horizon, or of nights illuminated by strange lights in the sky, those accounts fused with imagination. The aurora borealis, though unnamed then, became the living breath of Boreas, and the strange glow of the Arctic summer became evidence that the Hyperboreans existed after all. Greek scholars began to catalogue these distant peoples as part of a larger philosophical geography. The world, they believed, was a balanced structure, a circular disk or sphere divided into zones. The torrid south was too hot for human life, the frigid north too cold, and between them lay the temperate band where Greece thrived. But if the extreme north truly housed a people who lived in comfort and joy, it defied this symmetry. It suggested that there were regions where the divine intervened, where climate bent to the will of gods. That notion made Hyperborea more than myth. It became a theological exception, proof that perfection could exist under special grace. Herodotus, though sceptical by nature, handled the story with characteristic curiosity. In his histories, he wrote that while he could not confirm the existence of Hyperborea, he found the stories of their offerings too persistent to ignore. The Hyperboreans, according to legend, sent sacred gifts to Apollo's shrine on Delos, wrapped in straw, and carried south through a chain of neighbouring tribes, the Scythians, the Thracians, and others, until they reached Greece. Each tribe added new wrappings, treating the objects with reverence, as though passing along the warmth of the sun itself. For Herodotus, this tale spoke not only to the endurance of myth, but to a mysterious sense of connection between cultures that had never met. To the Greeks, this ritual exchange bridged heaven and earth. It implied a shared devotion, a symbolic kinship stretching across impossible distances. Even if Hyperborea couldn't be reached by ship or caravan, it could still touch Greece through ceremony and faith. In this way, the myth began to transcend geography entirely. The land became less important than the idea of communion, the sense that there was a northern mirror reflecting Greece's own reverence for balance, music, and reason. The poet Callimachus took the myth further. He described the Hyperborean maidens who brought those offerings to Delos, their names, Opis and Argi, etched into legend. When they died, the islanders honoured them with songs and dances, believing that their spirits still guided the path of the gifts each year. Through such stories, Hyperborea entered Greek religion not as a faraway land, but as a recurring presence, a gentle reminder of divine symmetry, of life in tune with light. In their temples, the Greeks built columns that reached toward heaven. In their minds, they built landscapes that reached toward perfection. Hyperborea became one of those imagined sanctuaries, a mental temple rather than a physical one. When philosophers later debated the nature of the cosmos, some even suggested that the Hyperboreans represented an earlier stage of humanity, when people lived closer to the gods and further from corruption. To them, history wasn't just progress but decline. The ancients believed that as time moved forward, the world grew heavier, more complicated, more imperfect. Hyperborea, untouched and ageless, embodied the opposite, a refusal to decay. In myth, the Hyperboreans were not alone. They had neighbours of sorts, the Arimaspians, one-eyed warriors who fought griffins over gold, the Scythians, nomadic horsemen known for their fierce independence, and beyond them, the Cimmerians, who lived in perpetual shadow. These tribes, half real and half symbolic, framed the mythic geography of the north. Together they created a kind of cosmic gradient, leading from darkness to light. Hyperborea sat at the final threshold, where the sun no longer obeyed earthly rules. The symbolism ran deep. To move north in Greek imagination was to move toward purity. It was the direction of Apollo, of intellect and clarity. To move south was to descend into passion and heat, the realm of Dionysus and instinct. In that opposition, Greek thought found balance, the north and south as mind and body, logic and emotion, harmony and ecstasy. Hyperborea stood as the pole of reason's serenity, a place where clarity never dimmed. In art, this ideal found expression through Apollo's iconography. He was often shown riding his chariot across the sky, driving away darkness with rays of order. His seasonal journey to Hyperborea symbolized not retreat but renewal, the restoration of light's equilibrium. Each winter, as the real sun's path dipped lower, the Greeks imagined their god travelling northward, not into exile but into radiance. It was a comforting inversion. When the world darkened, light itself was simply elsewhere, preparing to return. That cycle of disappearance and return gave rhythm to Greek life. The Delphic festivals marking Apollo's return each spring were not mere celebration. They were cosmic reassurance. They told the people that balance always comes back, that order never fully vanishes. Even today, the rhythm of seasons carries traces of that ancient faith in renewal. The idea that light withdraws only to return stronger is as human as breathing. Hyperborea's mythology seeped quietly into philosophy as well. Plato, though he never mentioned the name directly, echoed its spirit in his dialogues about ideal societies and the nature of virtue. The very notion of a realm governed by harmony, untouched by conflict, resonates with his republic and his metaphysical ideals. The Stoics, centuries later, adopted similar imagery. The idea that peace comes from aligning with the order of nature, living without excess or ambition. Though they rarely invoked the Hyperboreans, their serenity feels unmistakably northern. The legend also influenced early scientific curiosity. When Greek astronomers calculated the tilt of the Earth and noted that the sun behaved differently at high latitudes, they found a rational seed within the myth. The idea of a land where the sun never set was no longer fantasy. It was an observable reality for those far enough north. Pythias of Massalia's journey in the 4th century BCE confirmed it. He wrote of a region called Thule, 6 days beyond Britain, where summer days lasted nearly 24 hours. His account, though doubted by many, proved that the phenomenon described in Hyperborean myth had a basis in the natural world. What had once been poetic became partially empirical. The boundary between myth and science shifted a little. and Hyperborea's light began to glow through both lenses. The Greeks didn't need to abandon their myths when they found new knowledge. They absorbed it. In their worldview, truth could exist on multiple levels at once. The Hyperboreans could be both real and symbolic, their land both physical and metaphysical. To the rational mind, they represented climatic curiosity. To the spiritual mind, divine perfection. The coexistence of these meanings was not contradiction, it was harmony. As generations passed, Hyperborea became part of the grand fabric of Greek mythic geography, mentioned alongside the Isles of the Blessed and Elysium. Each described a place beyond suffering, yet Hyperborea remained unique in its accessibility. Unlike Elysium, which lay beyond death, Hyperborea existed within the world, just far enough away to remain untouched. That distinction gave it a subtle poignancy. It wasn't paradise after life, it was paradise still living somewhere, perhaps within reach if one only travelled far enough. This sense of attainable perfection gave Hyperborea its enduring allure. It was a promise wrapped in geography. For the poets, it symbolised hope. For the philosophers, balance. For the common listener, a comforting dream whispered through long nights. And for Apollo, ever radiant and distant, it remained a home, his northern sanctuary, where sunlight slept but never vanished. In time, the myth spread beyond Greece, carried through Rome and into later ages, adapting to new faiths and philosophies. But its Greek roots remained visible, its association with purity, harmony and light, all born from a culture that sought order in the cosmos and grace in the unknown. Even now, when we imagine lost civilizations of wisdom and calm, we are echoing the same northern dream that began among the poets of Delphi and Delos. And somewhere between the columns of marble and the snow that never melts, the thought of Hyperborea lingers, half memory, half prophecy, a whisper of what humanity still hopes to find when it looks beyond the known horizon. And as the ancient world's maps gave way to the explorers' charts and the poets' verses turned into navigation logs, the legend began to shift again, carried forward by those who believed they might one day locate that shining north upon the earth itself. If you trace the Greek imagination far enough north, you eventually meet the wind itself. The Greeks gave every force a face, and the north wind was no exception. His name was Boreas, and he was never merely a breeze. He was power incarnate, the cold rush that swept through mountain passes, the invisible gatekeeper of a region where mortals rarely ventured. To the ancient mind, to move beyond Boreas was to step past the living threshold of the world, a place where the known gave way to the divine, and where the line between history and heaven became very thin indeed. Boreas was not just a mythic presence. He was a constant reminder of how geography shaped imagination. The Greeks felt him every winter. His breath came roaring down from the Thracian mountains, rattling olive trees, whipping sails, and chilling stone temples. When Boreas blew, the Aegean turned wild, and fishermen waited out his moods. He was feared, but also respected, because he embodied the raw truth of nature. Beautiful, unpredictable, and untamable. To imagine lands lying beyond his reach was to imagine a peace greater than any they had known. Hyperborea, quite literally, meant beyond Boreas, beyond the chaos of wind, beyond the cry of winter. In art, Boreas was painted with wings, his hair streaming backward as though caught forever in motion. He was sometimes depicted with the face of a man and the body of a force, muscles coiled, robe billowing. His name became shorthand for anything cold, biting, and northern. He was one of the anemoi, the wind gods, each ruling a direction, each essential to balance. Zephyrus brought spring's warmth from the west, Notus carried summer rain from the south, Eurus blew autumn storms from the east, and Boreas delivered winter's sharp awakening from the north. Together they kept the seasons turning, their eternal movements shaping the rhythm of life. But Boreas was also a paradox. While he represented ferocity, he was woven into stories of love and alliance. One of his most famous myths tells of his abduction of Orithyia, daughter of the Athenian king Erechtheus. According to the tale, Boreas fell in love with her but was rejected. So he did what ancient gods often did. He seized her from the banks of the Ilissus River and carried her away to his northern kingdom. From their union were born winged sons, the Boreads, who later joined the Argonauts on their legendary voyage. The myth may seem violent to modern ears, but in its symbolism, the joining of an Athenian princess and the northern wind represented connection between the civilized world and the wild unknown. It was Greece acknowledging its dependence on the forces beyond its borders. The marriage of Orithyia and Boreas bound the nation to the north, both physically and mythically. That northern bond appeared again during war. When the Persians invaded Greece under Xerxes, it was said that Boreas himself intervened. According to Herodotus, as the Persian fleet advanced, a sudden storm from the north struck their ships, destroying many of them near Cape Sepias. The Greeks believed it was Boreas protecting them. They built him shrines afterward, honouring him not just as a wind but as a saviour. To them, the same force that froze and frightened could also deliver deliverance. The north, though cold, was not cruel. It could be merciful when aligned with divine will. The worship of Boreas shows how the Greeks bridged myth and meteorology. They didn't simply fear the weather, they humanized it, and in doing so they gave themselves a way to speak to it. The winds were not accidents of climate, they were moods of gods, and beyond those moods lay mysteries. So when poets wrote of Hyperborea lying past Boreas's domain, they weren't describing geography alone, they were describing transcendence. To pass beyond the wind god was to move past fear and into harmony. This transition from chaos to calm was central to how the Greeks imagined their world. Their cosmology wasn't static. It was layered, like a spiral ascending toward divinity. The mortal world sat at the base, filled with struggle and uncertainty. Above it lay realms of increasing order and purity. Olympus, home of the gods, occupied one of those higher rings. But Hyperborea, though it shared Olympus's serenity, was not confined to heaven. It was said to exist within the world, yet beyond its storms, a horizontal paradise rather than a vertical one. You didn't climb to Hyperborea, you journeyed through the wind to reach it. For philosophers, this made Hyperborea a fascinating idea. It wasn't exile from Earth, but perfection within it. The existence of a place beyond the destructive power of Boreas implied that nature itself had gradients of grace. The farther one travelled into the unknown, the closer one came to purity. In an age when exploration was still tentative, this was more than mythology. It was a moral geometry. The direction north became synonymous with transcendence. The poets elaborated endlessly on what life might be like in that peaceful region. Aeschylus described it as a land where the shining Hyperboreans dwell, whose feasts are unending, whose joy never fades. Pindar spoke of men who never know disease nor age and who live apart from toil and battle. These weren't mere fantasies. They were reflections of the Greek belief in cosmic order. Every storm implied its opposite calm. Every darkness hinted at light. Beyond the storm of Boreas lay balance itself. If you study Greek myth closely, you notice that the Greeks rarely placed perfection too close. Their utopias were always distant, hidden by seas, mountains, or winds. The perfect was never accessible, because accessibility would corrupt it. Hyperborea's position beyond Boreas preserved its sanctity. No mortal could walk there without first passing through difficulty, through the wind's test. In that sense, Boreas was not just an obstacle, but a guardian, a keeper of paradise. He was the test that separated the ordinary world from the divine. This symbolism runs deeper than it first appears. For the Greeks, the north wind was also the breath of renewal. After the languor of summer, Boreas swept the air clean. His cold made crops wither, but it also preserved the seeds for spring. He was destruction as preparation. And so, to move beyond him was not to flee from death, but to move through it toward transformation. Hyperborea, then, became the world after the storm, a vision of existence purified of all excess. The myth's endurance owes much to its ability to evolve with human understanding. As Greeks and later Romans learned more about the natural world, the figure of Boreas shifted from deity to phenomenon. But even stripped of his wings, he remained mysterious. The physical north continued to behave like the mythic one, its winds harsh, its skies radiant, its light strange. Travellers reported seeing the aurora as sheets of fire that rippled soundlessly across the heavens. Some said they heard whispers in the wind, others described patterns moving through the air like spirits. In the ancient imagination, these were traces of the god's breath, proof that Boreas and his kin were still at work. The north wind carried voices, stories, and sometimes fear. Sailors who ventured too far described moments when the compass seemed to lose its will, when air and sea blurred into one endless motion. The Greeks, who understood harmony as balance between opposites, must have sensed that the north embodied both the limit and the gateway. It was the place where nature spoke most clearly, and yet refused to explain itself. Hyperborea, resting beyond that invisible line, became the answer to that refusal, a promise that meaning still existed past the noise. Later thinkers would see the story in philosophical terms. The Stoics, especially, admired the idea of moving beyond the wind, beyond disturbance, into ataraxia, the stillness of the soul untouched by emotion. In their moral geography, Boreas represented passion and turmoil. Hyperborea symbolized serenity and reason. This alignment between myth and philosophy shows how flexible the imagery was. It could describe both physical and internal journeys. To go beyond Boreas wasn't just to cross a boundary of land or sky. It was to overcome the storm within. That inner dimension is perhaps what kept the myth alive long after the old gods faded. Boreas's breath still rattled shutters and bent trees, but people began to hear it differently. In the whispers of winter winds, they sensed not merely cold but invitation, the call to imagine what lay past fear. The north became not an end but a beginning. Even in later centuries, when Christian monks copied ancient manuscripts and redrew maps, the name of Boreas lingered. They placed his image in the margins, sometimes blowing gusts from puffed cheeks, sometimes riding clouds. These drawings were not acts of devotion but memory, echoes of a time when wind had personality. The monks might not have believed in him as a god, but they understood his metaphor. Beyond him still lay mystery, still lay the uncharted. The myth's persistence into the Renaissance was almost inevitable. The revival of classical learning rekindled interest in the old winds, the old boundaries. Scholars debated the literal meaning of Hyperborea, explorers chased its phantom through Arctic fog, and mystics turned it into a symbol of hidden wisdom. Boreas, once a roaring god, became the invisible threshold to enlightenment. Every gust of cold air, every storm sweeping across the seas, reminded humanity that wonder still waited in the direction of the impossible. To move beyond Boreas in thought was to question limits. Could there be lands the ancients had forgotten, civilizations erased by ice, wisdom buried under polar silence? The same questions that fueled geographic discovery also nourished spiritual speculation. The myth gave both endeavours a common direction, northward, and yet there was always humility in the legend. No matter how far one travelled, Hyperborea stayed just beyond reach. It was not a prize to be claimed, but a horizon to be contemplated. Boreas ensured that. He was the eternal reminder that some doors remain closed not because they are forbidden, but because their purpose is to make us wonder what's on the other side. In Greek temples, Boreas was often carved along with his fellow winds, frozen mid-breath, their faces contorted with the intensity of motion. Looking at those sculptures now, one sees not menace but energy, the sense that the world is alive and restless. That restlessness was the doorway the Greeks needed. It kept curiosity moving, kept myth breathing. Beyond that doorway, in the imagined calm of Hyperborea, they placed their longing for perfection. Between the wind and the silence, they built a world that never stopped existing in the mind, and so the legend of the wind god became more than a tale about weather. It became a philosophy about thresholds, about the necessity of struggle before serenity, motion before stillness. Boreas was not the enemy of Hyperborea, but its herald. Without his storm, the calm beyond would have no meaning. The Greeks might never have sailed through his invisible gate, but in their imagination they crossed it often. Every story, every hymn, every map that reached northward was another passage through the wind. Each time they named the unnameable, they pushed a little farther into that luminous impossible. The wind still moves through those ancient words. It carries fragments of the same thought, the belief that beyond the noise and cold and fear, something waits, patient and bright. Beyond Boreas, beyond the roaring of the known world, lies the eternal north that the Greeks dreamed into being. And as the breath of the god fades into the soft hum of distant air, the next vision begins to take shape, the one that captivated scholars and storytellers alike, the land itself, imagined in light and warmth, where the sun refused to set and the world seemed briefly perfect. To the ancients, the sun was not just a light in the sky, but the ultimate measure of balance. Its rising and setting, its warmth and absence governed every aspect of their lives. A world without night seemed almost unimaginable, and yet the Greeks dared to imagine it. They believed that far to the north, past the roaring of Boreas, there was a place where the sun never disappeared, where daylight lingered softly across the horizon, and where life unfolded in unbroken serenity. They called it the land of the Hyperboreans, but they also called it something else in their quietest musings, a paradise of perpetual light. The earliest Greek poets had no experience of such a phenomenon. They lived in a latitude where the sun behaved predictably, rising and setting with dependable rhythm. But travellers brought stories of lands where daylight lasted for months, and twilight blurred the edges of time. To minds attuned to symbolism, that kind of light could only mean divinity. A land bathed forever in sun was by definition a place untouched by death. Herodotus had heard enough of these tales to tread carefully between skepticism and awe. He admitted he could not confirm the Hyperboreans' existence, but their legend persisted through so many independent accounts that he could not dismiss it either. Later writers went further, describing the region with a confidence that bordered on devotion. Diodorus of Sicily, writing in the 1st century BCE, offered one of the most elaborate descriptions. He wrote of a land beyond the land of the Celts, where the climate was temperate and the people lived in perfect happiness. The sun, he said, shone there for half the year without setting. The inhabitants worshipped Apollo with greater reverence than any other nation, and the god himself visited them every 19 years when the stars completed their cycle. The Hyperboreans, he wrote, played instruments of silver, sang hymns to the rising and setting sun, and lived to great age in peace and prosperity. What strikes modern readers about Diodorus's account is how seamlessly he merged cosmology and emotion. His Hyperborea wasn't just a place, it was a feeling. Serenity shaped into geography. He blended scientific observation of polar light with mythic reverence for order. In his world there was no contradiction between astronomy and theology. The heavens and the divine were one and the same. The polar sun was not a physical curiosity. It was the embodiment of divine balance, a symbol of a universe that still made sense. Hecataeus, Pindar and Apollonius of Rhodes all contributed variations on the same image. Each described a realm bathed in sunlight where people lived without strife, nourished by the warmth of a god who never abandoned them. The idea found echoes in nearly every corner of ancient Greek thought. The philosopher Heraclides even proposed that the earth might be tilted, explaining why northern regions received different amounts of daylight. For him, the strange light of the Hyperborean lands became an opportunity to explore how cosmic design reflected moral order. If the earth leaned just enough to give some places more sun, Perhaps that tilt mirrored the way divine favour tilted toward virtue. In that sense, Hyperborea wasn't a contradiction to the Greek worldview, but a perfection of it. The Greeks valued moderation above all else, the balance between excess and deficiency. A land of perpetual day might seem immoderate, yet they imagined it as gentle rather than harsh. The sun there was not scorching but golden. Its light was steady and calm, like wisdom itself. Hyperborea became an allegory for the ideal life, a state of illumination without fatigue. The image of unending daylight also resonated with the Greeks' deep fear of darkness. Night was not merely the absence of light, it was the domain of uncertainty. In darkness, memory faltered and reason weakened. Myths of the underworld, of shadows and spirits, thrived in that absence. So the thought of a land where no night fell offered profound comfort. It promised a world without the unknown. To live without night was to live without fear. Yet there was another layer to the myth, one that made it more than escapism. The Greeks knew that total sunlight could be both blessing and burden. They were observers of cycles, and even in perfection they sought rhythm. So they didn't imagine Hyperborea as blazing with endless noon. Instead, they pictured a gentle twilight that lasted forever, a light soft enough for rest, but bright enough for joy. Their paradise was not one of glaring intensity, but of eternal balance, an equilibrium between wakefulness and dream. This vision found its way into the rituals of Apollo. The god's journey to Hyperborea each winter symbolized renewal through rest, light recovering its strength by visiting the place of endless day. In a curious way, this myth inverted reality. The Greeks' own winters were dark and cold, yet they imagined their god seeking light in the farthest north, where the sun never set. It was a paradox that they seemed to find soothing. When their own world dimmed, they could tell themselves that light still existed somewhere. It hadn't died. It had simply gone home for a while. Other cultures of the time shared similar dreams. The ancient Persians told of Ariana Veja, the first land created by Ahura Mazda, described as a perfect region of long summers and gentle winters, later ruined by evil and cold. The Hindus imagined Uttarakuru, a northern paradise of beauty and virtue where men lived for 1,000 years. Even the Celts, though far from the Aegean, spoke of northern islands bathed in continuous sunlight. The parallels suggest that this idea of a polar paradise came not from one culture's invention, but from a shared human intuition, the sense that beyond hardship lay an unreachable calm, a place where the sun of existence never dipped below despair. For ancient thinkers who tried to reconcile myth with observation, these accounts became puzzles worth solving. How could the sun stay visible for months? How could light behave differently across the earth? Anaxagoras, one of the early philosophers, proposed that the heavens were not divine beings but material objects governed by natural laws. To him, the varying length of days across regions was evidence that the world was curved. His rational explanation didn't destroy the myth, it deepened it. The idea that sunlight could bend around the world's shape gave Hyperborea new substance. Science became a new language for the same wonder. Aristotle, writing later, described the polar regions as inhabitable but distant. He had no evidence of perpetual day, but he accepted that the world was large enough to contain climates unlike Greece's. He noted that nature always provided equilibrium. If one region was dark for months, another would be bright. He never named Hyperborea, but his reasoning allowed for it. By affirming the symmetry of the world, he left space for its miracles. Even the historian Strabo, whose geographies leaned toward realism, left room for the legend. He wrote of the men beyond the Rhipaean mountains, who lived under skies of continuous brightness, their land fertile and free of storms. He considered it possible that these stories were exaggerated reports of northern latitudes, but conceded that in every myth there is a trace of truth. It was as close to validation as Hyperborea ever received from a serious geographer. In Rome, the myth transformed once more. The poet Horace invoked Hyperborea as a symbol of peace and withdrawal, a place untouched by politics or ambition. Ovid turned it into poetic metaphor, the unreachable calm that no hero could conquer. For him, Hyperborea represented the unspoiled world before desire. In his vision, it wasn't just north, it was before. That subtle shift, making the myth not distant but ancient, changed its tone. Hyperborea became not a destination but a memory, something humanity had lost. Roman authors also linked the land to physical phenomena. Pliny the Elder, always eager to catalogue the improbable, noted that far northern regions experienced half-year days and nights. His curiosity about the natural world echoed the same awe that had inspired Diodorus centuries earlier. He even speculated that the temperate climate described by the Greeks might be possible at certain latitudes due to the angle of sunlight. Though Pliny's science was limited, his method was sound. Observe, imagine, connect. In doing so, he gave the myth its first scientific footing. As centuries passed and maps grew clearer, the literal space for Hyperborea began to shrink, but its symbolic space expanded. Scholars of the Middle Ages copied Roman texts and repeated the idea of a northern realm of light. They placed it on maps as a circle of green amid a white sea. Sometimes they wrote Hyperborea across it, other times they left it blank, as though the name were too sacred to inscribe. The tradition of imagining paradise at the pole persisted, transformed by theology. To Christian scribes, the land of endless light became a shadow of Eden, a reminder that divine perfection once touched the earth. The idea that the north might hold secrets of creation never disappeared. Even as explorers began charting Arctic waters, the old longing crept into their reports. They wrote of landscapes glowing with strange colours, of mirages bending the horizon, of air so clear that distances became deceptive. They described long days that never seemed to end, their minds oscillating between wonder and exhaustion. The polar sun, it turned out, was as unsettling as it was beautiful. To see light without end was to confront eternity, and eternity was both gift and burden. The Greeks could never have imagined what the true Arctic looked like, yet their intuition wasn't far from truth. There really are places where the sun circles the horizon for weeks, where day dissolves into a golden haze that never cools into night. Standing there, one might understand what ancient poets meant by perfection. A world without the usual punctuation of darkness. The light feels alive, continuous, and strangely tender, as though time itself has paused to rest. This real phenomenon gives the myth a new dimension. It suggests that the story of Hyperborea may have been born not purely from imagination, but from distant echoes of observation. Traders from the north, perhaps from early Baltic or Scythian regions, could have told stories of such light to Greek listeners, who then translated it into poetry. What began as meteorological wonder became metaphysical truth. It is a reminder that myth often begins as a misunderstanding of beauty, and that misunderstanding can sometimes lead to wisdom. The notion of unending day carries with it a profound psychological resonance. Even now, in modern times, the idea of a place without darkness captures imagination. It represents transparency, purity, the absence of hidden motives. For the Greeks, whose pantheon often mirrored human flaws, Hyperborea offered relief, a divine realm where gods and men lived in harmony, unburdened by deceit or death. It wasn't just light that defined that world, it was clarity. And yet, the Greeks knew better than to believe that perfection came without cost. In their stories, Hyperborea remained unreachable, not because it was forbidden, but because humanity was not yet ready for its peace. To live without darkness required a kind of innocence the world had lost. That tension between the longing for light and the knowledge that light blinds as easily as it warms gave the myth its quiet melancholy. Hyperborea's beauty was inseparable from its distance. As the centuries unfolded, that image continued to shift but never faded. It became the model for utopias yet to come, from Renaissance speculations about polar continents to Enlightenment dreams of societies governed by reason and harmony. Each new age repainted the same northern glow in its own colours. The poets of Greece had planted the seed, and human imagination kept returning to it, drawn by the promise of endless day. Even now, when satellites photograph the pole in high resolution, and science explains the Earth's tilt down to decimals, something about that myth remains untouchable. The idea that there might be a place where light never dies still moves us. It is more than curiosity, it is the oldest form of hope. For the ancient writers who first dreamed it, Hyperborea was both destination and mirror. It reflected their yearning for order, their reverence for the cosmos, their belief that light itself could teach virtue. And in the golden quiet of that imagined world, half real, half remembered, they placed everything they thought was best about being human: calm, clarity, harmony, and the endless dawn that the spirit keeps chasing long after the maps have been filled, and as their pens rested and their parchments dried under Mediterranean sun, the story of that far northern paradise lingered, glowing softly at the edges of history, waiting for the next generation to rediscover it, to question whether paradise might, after all, have once touched the world we know. The Middle Ages inherited the ancient world in fragments, half-remembered texts, weathered stones, and whispers that refused to fade. Among these remnants, certain ideas clung to survival not through proof, but through fascination. Hyperborea was one of them. Its name, soft and distant, travelled from Greek verse to Latin prose, from parchment to vellum, carried by scribes who often copied words they could not entirely understand. What began as a golden dream of the ancients found quiet shelter in the margins of medieval scholarship, where faith and curiosity often shared the same candlelight. For centuries after the fall of Rome, Europe's knowledge of the wider world shrank. Roads crumbled, trade routes shifted, libraries burned. The finely measured maps of the classical age faded from memory, replaced by diagrams of creation drawn with reverence rather than precision. The world, once mapped by geometry and empire, was now a theatre for God's plan. Yet even in that new order, the old stories persisted, transformed but not erased. Hyperborea no longer belonged to the philosophers. It became the property of monks, mystics, and poets, who saw in it not a geographical puzzle, but a reflection of divine perfection. In monastic scriptoria, knowledge was an act of devotion. Scribes copied texts by hand, often without commentary, preserving words as though they were relics. Many of those words carried faint traces of the ancient North. Pindar, Herodotus, and Diodorus survived in Latin translations, their passages about the Hyperboreans copied with the same care as scripture. The names of gods faded into allegory, but the imagery of light, harmony, and the unreachable north resonated with Christian symbolism. The monks who read of a land without night recognized something familiar, the echo of paradise. To them, Hyperborea became less a pagan myth and more an allegory of Eden restored. In the harsh winters of medieval Europe, when cold pressed against stone walls and candles flickered in narrow cloisters, the thought of a northern world filled with warmth and sunlight must have felt almost holy. It aligned neatly with Christian notions of the afterlife, a place beyond suffering, where creation returned to purity. The Hyperboreans' endless daylight was easily reinterpreted as the eternal light of God. What had once been Apollo's sanctuary became, in their imagination, a symbol of divine grace surviving beyond human corruption. This transformation happened gradually. In the early medieval period, knowledge was filtered through a few surviving encyclopedias and world chronicles. Isidore of Seville, writing in the 7th century, compiled the Etymologie, a vast encyclopedia that gathered all known wisdom from antiquity. He listed the Hyperboreans briefly, describing them as a people living far to the north, beyond the blasts of the north wind under skies of perpetual light. He treated them as part of the natural order, not as fantasy. In Isidore's view, they were one more example of the diversity of God's creation, proof that wonder existed at every corner of the earth. Later compilers, drawing from him and others, repeated the entry. They had no reason to doubt it. Medieval scholarship valued continuity over originality. To copy was to preserve truth, to question was to risk error. The legend of Hyperborea, fixed in the authority of ancient authors, became part of accepted geography. On maps, it migrated northward with each generation, drifting across parchment seas like a quiet memory refusing to die. Medieval maps were never meant to be practical tools for travel. They were devotional objects, diagrams of belief. The Mappa Mundi, the map of the world, showed history and theology woven into one surface. Jerusalem sat at the centre, paradise often appeared in the east, and the unknown was filled with marvels. At the northern edge, where the world curved toward mystery, scribes sometimes drew islands or inscriptions. Hic sunt dracones, here be dragons. But not all those inscriptions warned of danger. Some spoke of wonder. In certain manuscripts a note would appear, Terra Hyperboreorum, the land of the Hyperboreans. There, among dragons and saints, the old paradise persisted, quietly glowing at the top of the world. The persistence of the name shows how medieval thought blended myth and theology without conflict. To the medieval scholar, the physical and the spiritual were not separate realms, but layers of the same reality. A land of perpetual light could exist both as geography and as symbol. It could be the far northern reaches of creation, or the shining boundary of heaven. The distinction hardly mattered. What mattered was that the world was vast enough to contain it. The idea of a luminous north also resonated with medieval cosmology. The heavens were understood as spheres of light surrounding the earth, each ruled by celestial order. The closer one moved to the divine, the brighter and purer the light became. The north, though physically cold, was symbolically bright. The pole star, fixed and constant, represented divine stability amid the chaos of earthly motion. To imagine a realm beyond the north wind was to imagine a place aligned with that perfect stillness, the unmoving centre of creation's circle. Hyperborea, in this context, was not far away but above, existing just at the border between heaven and earth. As Europe's intellectual life slowly revived, scholars began to rediscover the works of ancient authors in their original Greek. The 12th and 13th centuries saw a quiet awakening of classical knowledge. Monasteries in Ireland, France, and Italy began translating and commenting on Aristotle, Plato, and the geographers. Among those rediscovered names, Hyperborea reappeared, now discussed not as myth but as part of ancient geography. Medieval scholars like Vincent of Beauvais and Brunetto Latini included the Hyperboreans in their encyclopedic works, blending classical sources with biblical chronology. They speculated about the origins of nations and the spread of peoples after the flood, weaving Hyperborea into the grand narrative of human descent from Noah's sons. In this biblical framework, the Hyperboreans sometimes became descendants of Japheth, the ancestor of Indo-European nations. To the medieval mind, that connection made sense. The north belonged to Japheth's lineage, the realm of logic and philosophy, while the south belonged to Ham's passion and the east to Shem's spirituality. By integrating the myth into this structure, the scholars gave it legitimacy within Christian cosmology. The legend of Hyperborea survived not as heresy, but as heritage. Illuminated manuscripts from this period show how seamlessly myth could coexist with doctrine. On one page, a miniature of the Nativity, on another, a map of the world with Hyperborea marked near the Arctic, bordered by mountains and seas. The same ink that recorded the Gospels preserved the geography of a pagan paradise. The scribes who drew those lines might not have believed in Apollo or his worshippers, but they understood reverence. For them, copying ancient knowledge was an act of humility before the mystery of creation. The fascination with the North deepened as Europe expanded its horizons. Norse sagas filtered southward, telling of lands of eternal day and night. Reports of ice, auroras, and strange lights mingled with the inherited Greek imagination. In Icelandic texts, there were descriptions of the lands of brightness, where the sun circled endlessly, and even medieval chroniclers began to suspect that the old stories might not be entirely allegorical. Some wondered if the Hyperboreans had been early inhabitants of those northern islands. Others speculated that the myth was a memory of pre-flood civilizations now buried under ice. The blending of myth, scripture, and folklore gave the legend new resilience. During the Renaissance, when printing began to replace the quill, those old manuscripts were recopied again, this time not in monasteries but in universities and private libraries. The humanists who read them rediscovered the word Hyperborea with fresh curiosity. To them, it represented a link to antiquity, a symbol of the wisdom that had survived the dark centuries. Renaissance maps revived the name, placing it once again near the top of the world. Cartographers like Ortelius and Mercator copied older sources faithfully, even when their science had outgrown the need for myth. The North remained a blank space, and into that blankness the past could still speak. The survival of Hyperborea through the medieval period is, in a way, a story about how ideas endure when they lose their original meaning. The monks who copied those passages were not preserving Greek religion. They were preserving wonder. They understood that the world was richer when it contained mystery. Every illuminated initial, every line of text they traced, carried forward a sense that the unknown was worth protecting. It is difficult to imagine the patience of those scribes. In cold rooms lit by single lamps, they worked for hours, bending over parchment, shaping each letter with slow devotion. They might have whispered prayers as they wrote, not realizing that the words beneath their hands described a sun that never set, and yet their labour gave the myth immortality. Without them, the North would have gone silent. Hyperborea's endurance through those centuries also speaks to a universal human habit, the inability to let go of paradise. The classical world had placed its perfection in the North. Christianity placed it in the East. But in both visions, the geography was secondary. What mattered was the feeling of distance, the knowledge that somewhere beyond corruption, perfection still existed. The monks may have seen Hyperborea as symbolic, but symbolism was enough. It allowed the ancient hope to persist, dressed now in the robes of faith. Even as the age of exploration dawned and ships began to venture beyond familiar seas, the myth still clung to the imagination. Medieval scholars had passed it forward not as a fact, but as a question. And questions, unlike answers, tend to survive the longest. When the Renaissance thinkers opened those old volumes and found mention of the Hyperboreans, they felt the same pull their Greek ancestors had felt, a desire to reconcile legend with landscape. The medieval scribes had frozen the story in time, preserved it like an insect in amber. Now, under new light, it would begin to move again. And so, from monastery to map, from ink to exploration, the legend thawed. The frozen paradise that once lived only in verse would soon drift into the age of voyages, when men in wooden ships would chase the horizon northward, believing that beyond the ice lay the warm breath of a forgotten civilization. By the time Europe awakened from the medieval centuries and began to look outward again, the maps that had once been devotional were becoming instruments of ambition. The compass had replaced the relic as the tool of faith. But even as navigation became more precise, imagination refused to surrender. The Renaissance saw both the rediscovery of classical wisdom and the rebirth of the unknown. The same minds that measured the stars with brass astrolabes still whispered about lands unseen. Among them, one name continued to gleam faintly through the fog of antiquity: Hyperborea. The men who sailed under new flags were driven by curiosity and commerce in equal measure. They chased spices, gold, and routes to Asia, but they also chased stories. Ancient texts resurfaced in Latin translations. Geographers rediscovered the writing of Strabo, Pliny, and Diodorus. The world, once thought small and centred, began to stretch. As ships pushed past familiar coasts, old myths migrated to new latitudes. Paradise, it seemed, had simply moved. If it was not in the east or under the sea, perhaps it waited in the far north, hidden behind the fog and ice. It was an age intoxicated by rediscovery. Scholars pored over Ptolemy's Geographia, attempting to reconcile its coordinates with new reports from explorers. Artists filled atlases with drawings of sea monsters and cities yet unseen. The invention of the printing press spread both fact and fantasy faster than ever before, and on many of those printed maps, produced in workshops in Venice, Antwerp, or Amsterdam, the northern edge of the world remained unfinished. That blank space invited speculation. It begged for a name. For some, the ancient whisper of Hyperborea seemed like a fitting inscription. In 1569, Gerardus Mercator released his Great World Map, a masterpiece of geometry and imagination. Using a new cylindrical projection that allowed sailors to plot straight-line courses, Mercator redrew the world. Yet even he, master of mathematical precision, filled the poles with wonder. At the top of his map, he placed 4 vast islands surrounding a black magnetic mountain. Rivers flowed inward between them, feeding a whirlpool that swallowed the seas. Around this strange configuration, he wrote the names of ancient lands, Hyperborea among them. It was both a tribute to myth and a confession of ignorance. Mercator, for all his intellect, understood that maps are never complete. They are portraits of curiosity at a given moment. The idea of a northern paradise persisted because explorers kept returning with tales that seemed to confirm it. Sailors spoke of waters that stayed strangely calm, of luminous skies that shimmered even at midnight, of air so pure it felt otherworldly. The accounts were often exaggerated, but the wonder was real. The Arctic, in its stillness, played tricks on perception. Sound carried farther, light behaved differently, and distances seemed uncertain. To people raised in temperate lands, this new world felt unreal. The conditions that made it difficult to survive were the same ones that made it feel supernatural. As expeditions pressed northward, first under English and Dutch flags, then under Russian and Scandinavian, they discovered more ice than gold, more hardship than paradise. Yet the idea of a white continent, pure and ancient, persisted. The term didn't yet refer to Antarctica. It meant the mysterious land that old maps placed near the pole, often ringed by seas or mountains. Some believed it to be the last remnant of a lost world. Others thought it was the site of the biblical flood survivors. Theologians speculated that Hyperborea might have been the refuge of those righteous enough to escape divine punishment. This merging of scripture and exploration gave the legend new vitality. The 16th and 17th centuries were full of attempts to harmonize the Bible with the rediscovered globe. Every new land had to fit into a story already written. The ancient myth of the Hyperboreans, now centuries old, became one of the possible keys to explaining geography's mysteries. It allowed the faithful to believe that discovery was not invention, but revelation, that the world they were uncovering had always been known, merely forgotten. Writers like Olaus Magnus, a Swedish historian and Catholic cleric, helped reintroduce northern wonder to European audiences. His Historia de Gentibus Septentrionalibus, History of the Northern Peoples, published in 1555, described the far north as a land of marvels, icebergs shaped like cathedrals, auroras like heavenly fires, creatures half fish and half serpent. He filled his pages with both careful observation and indulgent fantasy. To his readers, the North became a realm of awe and terror, a place where God's power revealed itself in raw form. Though he never mentioned Hyperborea by name, the spirit of the myth lived in every line. The Arctic had become the theatre of divine creation again. Soon the idea of a hidden land in the north began to attract not just theologians, but natural philosophers and alchemists. The Renaissance had blurred the boundaries between science and mysticism. Curiosity flowed freely between them. Men who studied magnetism and astronomy also studied ancient geography. Mercator himself corresponded with John Dee, the English mathematician and advisor to Queen Elizabeth I, who believed in sacred geometry and the possibility of lost civilizations. Dee read maps as holy texts, full of symbols waiting to be decoded. For him, the Northern Pole was not merely a point of navigation, it was the axis of the Earth's soul. Dee and others like him speculated that a great polar continent might once have existed, before a cataclysm sank or froze it. Some called it Hyperborea, others Thule, Ultima Thule, or simply the White Land. They believed it was the cradle of ancient wisdom, the origin of humanity's first sciences. These ideas, drawn partly from Platonic philosophy and partly from mystical traditions, influenced generations of thinkers. The polar regions became symbols of purity, too remote for corruption, too bright for deceit. The voyages of the Elizabethan era fed this fascination. Martin Frobisher's expeditions in the 1570s, though motivated by the search for gold and a northwest passage, returned with descriptions of vast ice fields glowing under endless twilight. His reports, combined with rumours of unknown lands glimpsed through fog, deepened the sense of mystery. Each failure to find a passage added to the allure of what might lie just beyond. The imagination filled the void with the same patterns it always had: light, perfection, and the dream of a hidden north. In the centuries that followed, as exploration pushed farther, the myth adapted once more. The 17th and 18th centuries turned curiosity into empire. Expeditions became national projects, funded by monarchs and academies. Maps grew more accurate, but accuracy did not diminish wonder. It only relocated it. The White Continent moved outward as ice receded from imagination into geography. When explorers failed to find Hyperborea, they began to speculate that it might have vanished, swallowed by time or climate change. The idea that an ancient civilization could be buried under ice became more believable, as glaciers revealed fossils of strange creatures, proof that the Earth had changed before and could change again. Science and myth began to intertwine more intimately. Early geologists studying rock strata and seashells embedded in mountain stone concluded that entire landscapes had once been submerged. Some speculated that the poles themselves might have shifted, turning tropical lands into frozen wastelands. If that were true, then perhaps Hyperborea was real, a civilization destroyed when the axis of the world moved. The theory appealed to both rationalists and romantics. It provided a natural explanation for a supernatural story, keeping the mystery alive while granting it the dignity of science. The Romantic era of the 19th century gave the legend new emotional colour. Writers and painters turned the Arctic into a symbol of the sublime, the place where human courage met the infinite. Explorers like John Franklin and Fridtjof Nansen ventured into the ice with the same reverence the Greeks had felt for their gods. The North, once imagined as paradise, had become a mirror for the soul's endurance. But the language of paradise persisted, even in tragedy. When Franklin's expedition vanished in 1845, newspapers described the Arctic as a realm where the white silence keeps its own secrets. The phrase could have come straight from an ancient hymn to Hyperborea. The 19th century also revived interest in ancient myths through the lens of comparative mythology. Scholars began to notice that many cultures had stories of northern homelands, or lands of eternal light. The Indo-Europeans spoke of a polar origin, the Hindus of Uttarakuru, the Persians of Ariana Veja. Some theorists suggested that all these myths pointed to a single lost cradle of civilization, located in the far north. In their view, Hyperborea was not metaphor but memory, a dim recollection of humanity's prehistoric home before ice and time erased it. This idea fascinated not only scholars, but also mystics. Theosophists in the late 19th and early 20th centuries adopted Hyperborea as part of their spiritual cosmology, describing it as the second great root race of humanity, an age when beings of light walk the earth. Though these later interpretations departed from historical evidence, they showed how adaptable the myth remained. Each era found in Hyperborea a reflection of its own dreams. For the Greeks, harmony; for the medieval monks, holiness; for the explorers, discovery; for the occultists, transcendence. The search for the white continent became, over time, both literal and symbolic. Expeditions to the Arctic and Antarctica continued into the 20th century, but even as planes replaced caravels and cameras replaced compasses, the fascination endured. The ice itself seemed to guard its mysteries, revealing fragments of ancient climates, lost fossils, and traces of deep time. The modern scientist drilling through permafrost is, in a sense, performing the same act as the medieval scribe copying old verses, reaching into the frozen past for a fragment of understanding. What the explorers discovered, again and again, was that the poles were not empty. They were archives. Layers of ice held stories written in air bubbles and dust, recording thousands of years of change. Each core sample was a chronicle of the planet's memory, a new kind of manuscript. In that sense, the dream of Hyperborea found an unexpected fulfillment. The North truly did preserve the past, not as cities or temples, but as the atmosphere itself, frozen and waiting to speak. The image of the white continent persisted into literature and art. Poets described the Arctic as a mirror of first creation. Painters rendered icebergs as cathedrals of light. Explorers spoke of hallucinations under the midnight sun, visions of towers, plains, and radiant cities that shimmered in the heatless glow. Science explained them as mirages, but the language remained devotional. Even reason could not entirely silence awe. As centuries layered upon one another, the name Hyperborea faded from maps, but not from imagination. It lingered in books, in whispered theories, in the quiet conviction that the Earth still held places where myth and matter touched. The explorers had not found the paradise of endless day, but they had found something equally strange, a beauty that defied comfort, a silence that spoke louder than any legend. The old dream, once traced on parchment and sung by poets, now drifted through polar fog. It no longer needed a name. It had become part of humanity's collective yearning, the instinct to believe that the world is larger, older, and more mysterious than any chart can show. And so, even as the ice hardened and ships turned back, the search continued, not in geography but in imagination. For every explorer who returned empty-handed, another writer took up the story. Every blank horizon became a page, every mirage a reminder that paradise, once imagined, never truly disappears. Somewhere beyond the frozen waves, beneath the aurora's shifting veil, the memory of Hyperborea still shimmered, a distant echo of the belief that knowledge and wonder are never enemies, but companions, travelling side by side into the unknown. And as those explorers carried the light of discovery deeper into the Arctic night, the next chapter of the legend was already forming, not on decks or maps, but in books and societies dedicated to ancient wisdom, where mystics and scholars alike would claim that Hyperborea had never been lost at all, only hidden beneath symbols waiting to be read. When explorers began to map the northern reaches of the world in earnest, they carried more than instruments and provisions. They carried the inheritance of centuries, legends etched faintly behind every measurement. The Arctic in their minds was not just a region, it was a riddle left behind by antiquity. Somewhere amid the shifting ice, the flickering lights, and the endless horizon, they half expected to find confirmation of what poets and philosophers had always hinted, that the top of the world concealed a secret. The compass, that quiet miracle of magnetism, had already changed how humanity saw direction. Before its invention, navigation was a matter of stars, sun, and instinct. With the compass, the invisible forces of the earth became visible, a needle trembling toward an unseen pole, an unseen power. For those first sailors who watched it move, it must have felt like holding a fragment of mystery in their hands. They knew it pointed north, but they didn't yet understand why. To many, that unseen attraction was more than physics. It was evidence of something sacred at the world's crown. The pole was not just magnetic, it was metaphysical. As early map makers tried to understand the phenomenon, they gave the north a shape. Mercator's black magnetic mountain at the centre of the Arctic, the Rupes Nigra, became one of the era's most enduring symbols. Some said it was a rock of lodestone so powerful that it drew all metal toward it, even the stars. Others imagined it as the pillar of the world, the point around which heaven and earth turned. This single image merged scientific speculation with ancient cosmology. The axis mundi, the world's axis described by Plato and the Stoics, seemed to have found its physical home. Atlas makers in the 16th and 17th centuries copied Mercator's idea faithfully. They filled the northern pole with rings of islands, rivers and mountain ranges, all converging on the mysterious centre. Around these lands they placed Latin inscriptions, Hyperborea, Septentrionalis, Terra Incognita. The shapes differed from one edition to another, but the meaning remained constant. The pole was not empty. It was alive with unseen forces, with histories lost to ice and wind. To understand the persistence of that image, one must remember how the Arctic behaved to those early explorers. Their compasses quivered unpredictably, their instruments gave inconsistent readings, and the light itself refused to obey normal rules. In summer, the sun circled the horizon like a watchful god. In winter, it disappeared entirely, leaving only auroral fire. Magnetic variation, the shifting difference between true north and magnetic north, bewildered navigators. It was as if the world itself were protecting its secrets, luring them forward with beauty, then clouding their senses with distortion. Reports of strange phenomena poured in from ships and outposts. Sailors spoke of luminous arcs dancing in the sky, of compasses spinning without warning, of echoes that carried over the ice like whispers. The natural world, so often predictable at lower latitudes, seemed to behave with deliberate enigma. These conditions fed the conviction that something extraordinary, perhaps supernatural, rested at the pole. In a time when science was young and superstition still familiar, the two were indistinguishable companions. The 17th century saw the rise of more precise cartography, but precision did not erase enchantment. Explorers like Henry Hudson and Willem Barents ventured into the frozen seas with maps that still bore traces of the mythical islands. When they returned, or when their ships did without them, their journals often contained moments of wonder written alongside hardship. Hudson described light so bright it seemed to burn in the heavens. Barents wrote of nights when the air glowed faintly, even without the moon. These observations, later recognized as the aurora borealis, only deepened the sense that the Arctic was no ordinary realm. For scholars back in Europe, these accounts arrived through letters, charts, and printed narratives that blended fact and imagination. The Royal Society in London, newly founded in 1660, published reports of magnetism and northern lights with the same curiosity it gave to celestial comets. Philosophers tried to explain the behaviour of compasses using invisible effluvia, streams of unseen matter flowing from the poles. Each theory sought to domesticate mystery, but the mystery refused to be tamed. The more data they gathered, the stranger the north seemed. Magnetic variation changed with longitude, suggesting that the pole itself might wander. This notion of a living, shifting force at the heart of the planet sounded almost mythic. To the old mind, it was Hyperborea reasserting itself, adapting to a scientific age. The world was still enchanted. It simply wore a different vocabulary. By the 18th century, the Arctic had become a mirror for human desire and fear. Nations sent expeditions northward not only to claim trade routes, but also to claim knowledge itself. The ice became a frontier of the mind. Each new voyage was both a geographical and a philosophical statement. If man could reach the pole, he could reach the limits of the possible, but each failure reminded them that some limits remained inviolate. Captain James Cook's third voyage in 1776 pushed farther than most before him. He reached the edge of the ice near Alaska and sailed westward into waters never before mapped. His observations were meticulous, his instruments advanced, yet even he could not shake the allure of the unseen north. He wrote of water that appeared glassy under constant light, of a horizon so smooth it seemed infinite. Cook was a man of reason, yet he recorded his impressions in language tinged with awe. The Arctic stripped explorers of certainty, leaving them vulnerable to wonder. Around the same time, scientific academies in France, England and Russia began to treat the Arctic as a laboratory for natural laws. Expeditions carried magnetometers, chronometers, and thermometers, instruments designed to measure what had once been mystical. But the act of measuring did not diminish the magic. It magnified it. The readings often defied expectation. Compasses would twitch near certain rock formations, iron objects would lose or gain polarity, and faint magnetic disturbances would ripple through instruments without visible cause. These anomalies inspired new theories. Perhaps the Earth's core was alive, or perhaps vast metallic mountains lay buried beneath the pole. Every attempt to explain the phenomenon circled back to the same idea, that the North hid something fundamental. In those same years, maps grew cleaner, the mythical islands shrinking as explorers filled in coastlines. Yet even as the cartographic details became accurate, the pole itself remained blank. It was a small circular void at the centre of precision, a perfect symbol of what humanity still did not know. Map after map left it empty, a reminder that even the most exact measurements required faith in the unseen. Writers and philosophers of the Enlightenment turned this emptiness into metaphor. Jean-Jacques Rousseau saw in the North a symbol of purity, an untouched nature beyond civilization's corruption. Immanuel Kant used the pole as an image of moral constancy, the point around which all ethical compasses should align. The Romantic poets inherited both ideas, turning the Arctic into the ultimate expression of the sublime, the union of beauty and terror. The landscape that had once been Hyperborea's paradise now became a realm of confrontation, where man met the infinite and was humbled. But beneath those shifting interpretations, the old myth structure endured. Hyperborea had always been about the place beyond reach, the land where natural law bent toward harmony. In a world increasingly governed by science, that longing found expression in the polar magnetic field itself. Invisible, intangible, yet undeniably real, magnetism became the new divinity. The compass needle was its oracle, trembling with unseen purpose. To follow it north was to pursue truth through uncertainty, the same pursuit that had driven philosophers for millennia. The 19th century brought technological confidence and renewed obsession. Steamships replaced sails, and with them came the promise of endurance. Nations competed to reach the pole, claiming it as both glory and proof of progress. The British Admiralty funded one expedition after another, convinced that a Northwest Passage must exist. The maps of that era are filled with dotted lines, marking the imagined routes of ships that would never return. The blank spaces grew smaller but also sadder, filled with the names of those who vanished trying to cross them. Yet even as these explorers perished, the legend of the North deepened. Newspapers and serialized books turned their journeys into epic sagas. The Arctic was no longer just geography, it was theatre. And at the heart of that frozen stage remained the phantom of Hyperborea, reshaped into whatever the century most desired. For the imperialists, it symbolized conquest. For the romantics, purity. For the scientists, knowledge. For the dreamers, transcendence. The 1800s also saw the first systematic study of Earth's magnetism. Scholars like Alexander von Humboldt and Carl Friedrich Gauss mapped magnetic declination across continents, attempting to chart the unseen currents that bound compass to pole. Their work revealed patterns that resembled breathing, lines converging and diverging, expanding and contracting. The planet itself seemed alive, its magnetic pulse beating in time with the sun's. The old notion of a world animated by divine energy returned in scientific form. Hyperborea had become physics. Humboldt himself felt the romance of this discovery. He described the Earth as a living organism, its forces circulating like blood. His words, though written in the language of science, carried the same tone of reverence found in Pindar's hymns. The circle had closed. The explorers who traced magnetic meridians across the Arctic were unknowingly continuing the same quest the Greeks had begun, to locate the axis of order, the point around which everything turns. By the end of the century, the Arctic was more mapped than ever, yet more mysterious than before. Compasses still behaved strangely near the magnetic pole, which turned out not to coincide with the geographic one. The discovery that the two poles were separate and that the magnetic pole moved added another layer of intrigue. Even in an age of reason, the North refused to stay still. The world, like the myth, resisted final explanation. Artists followed. Painters rendered vast, silent landscapes of ice and light. Writers turned the pole into a metaphor for obsession. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein opened and closed with letters from an Arctic explorer, framing science itself as a journey into the forbidden North. Poe's narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym imagined a descent into a blinding polar abyss. Later, Jules Verne's Journey to the Centre of the Earth and H.P. Lovecraft's At the Mountains of Madness both drew from the same imagery: ice, light, and the whisper of something ancient beneath the surface. In every retelling, the Arctic became a boundary between knowledge and myth. By the dawn of the 20th century, when airships and airplanes began to cross the polar skies, the phantom of Hyperborea had dissolved into atmosphere. Yet even with photographic evidence, satellite imaging and magnetic models, the fascination persisted. The North remained a place where instruments could record, but imagination could still wander. Scientists studying the aurora with spectrometers described its movement in words that echoed ancient awe. Curtains of light, rivers of fire, ghosts in the sky. The compass still trembled as it had centuries before, pointing toward a shift in mystery. The map still left the pole slightly blank, not for lack of data, but for lack of certainty. And in that quiet uncertainty, the myth endured. Today, the Arctic exists as both laboratory and legend. Climate scientists measure its melting ice, archaeologists study ancient migration routes, and satellites trace its magnetic drift. Yet every photograph, every chart, carries an unspoken echo, the sense that we are observing not just a place but a memory. The White Continent, the phantom land, the unreachable North, still hovers between myth and matter. Hyperborea, though absent from modern atlases, survives in the same way constellations do, names given to meaning before we had instruments to define it. The compass still points to its shadow. The light of the aurora still sweeps across its imagined sky. The story, like magnetism itself, continues unseen but never unfelt. And as those glowing curtains ripple silently across the Arctic night, one can almost imagine the faint music the Greeks once described, the hymn of the Hyperboreans carried on the wind beyond Boreas's breath, still singing of a light that never fades. And from that trembling horizon, the story drifts onward, toward those who would turn from compasses to stars, from explorers to philosophers, and from maps to mysteries of mind and soul, seeking in myth what centuries of discovery could never quite find. When the 19th century faded into the 20th, The world seemed to believe that mystery was retreating. The age of machines had arrived, and steam, wire, and iron had conquered what myth once guarded. But even in an age of science, wonder never disappears. It only changes disguise. As telescopes and telegraphs stretched human reach, another current began to flow quietly beneath the surface of modernity. It moved through drawing rooms, secret societies, and candlelit studies filled with old maps and new obsessions. It was in these circles, where mysticism met scholarship and curiosity blurred into faith, that the name Hyperborea rose again. For centuries the legend had lingered on the edges of history, half remembered, half believed. But the late 19th century was an age that hungered for origins. Archaeology was reshaping the past, linguistics was tracing the ancestry of languages, and geology was stretching the timeline of the Earth itself. Amid that upheaval, people began to ask questions older than science could answer. If civilization was so ancient, where had it begun? What if the myths of lost golden ages were not mere imagination, but fragments of memory? The ancient paradise beyond the north wind, forgotten by reason but preserved by dream, suddenly felt relevant again. The revival began with books, those quiet messengers that carried old symbols into new centuries. Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, the Russian mystic and co-founder of the Theosophical Society, became one of the first to speak of Hyperborea not as legend but as history in disguise. In her writings, she described cycles of human evolution, ages of light and shadow, each ruled by different root races. According to her cosmology, Hyperborea had been the cradle of the second great age of humanity, an epoch when beings of immense height and luminous intellect walked the earth. It was not a land of mortals as we know them, but of predecessors, semi-divine ancestors who lived in harmony with natural law. To Blavatsky's followers, the name Hyperborea no longer belonged to Greece. It belonged to prehistory itself. She wrote that before Atlantis sank, before Lemuria dissolved into the Pacific, there had been Hyperborea, a continent at the northern pole now hidden beneath ice. Its people had not died, she said. They had transcended. Their wisdom, preserved in esoteric symbols and mythic echoes, guided later civilizations unconsciously. The Greeks, in her telling, had merely inherited the memory. Apollo's yearly journey to the Hyperboreans was no poetic invention. It was a mythic echo of a time when gods and men were one, when the sun itself hovered eternally above the horizon. These ideas found eager listeners. The Theosophical Society, founded in 1875, became a gathering point for scholars and seekers dissatisfied with materialism. Its meetings combined metaphysics, comparative religion, and fragments of forgotten science. The Society's journals published essays on ancient continents, polar migrations, and the spiritual geography of the Earth. Hyperborea, long silent, became a central concept in this new cosmology. It represented the purity before corruption, the dawn before history. What made the theosophical vision powerful was its synthesis. It wove myth, geology, anthropology, and astronomy into a single tapestry. The North was not just cold and distant, it was sacred. It was the axis around which creation turned, a living symbol of evolution's hidden rhythm. Maps of the era show how this imagination took form, concentric circles radiating from the pole, continents and oceans arranged like ripples in a cosmic sea. At the centre, always, lay the vanished Hyperborea, the seed of all that came after. From the Theosophists, the idea spread into countless branches of esoteric thought. The French occultist Joseph-Alexandre Saint-Yves d'Alvedre wrote of Agartha, a hidden realm beneath the earth ruled by wise beings descended from the Hyperboreans. His works described subterranean cities linked by tunnels and governed by spiritual harmony. Others adapted the imagery, merging it with Hindu and Buddhist cosmology. The North became not only a direction but a symbol of ascension, the path of return to origins. In Parisian salons and London lodges, Hyperborea was discussed alongside Atlantis and Mu, not as separate myths, but as parts of a larger lost order. Writers spoke of a primordial civilization that spread knowledge to the rest of the world, before withdrawing northward when catastrophe struck. These ideas appealed to an era that sensed both progress and decay. The modern world, noisy with invention, longed for a sense of sacred beginnings. Hyperborea provided it. It promised that enlightenment was not something new, but something ancient waiting to be remembered. By the early 20th century, this esoteric geography had crossed into the realm of pseudoscience. Writers like William Scott Elliott and Rudolf Steiner elaborated on Blavatsky's framework, describing Hyperborea in increasingly vivid terms. They claimed it was a continent of gentle climate, inhabited by beings who communicated through thought rather than speech, whose cities shone with natural light. Steiner, blending theosophy with his own anthroposophy, described the Hyperboreans as humanity before matter hardened, creatures still luminous, existing halfway between spirit and form. To modern historians, such claims may seem fanciful, but they reveal something profound about the age that produced them. Industrialization had changed everything: time, space, and identity. The speed of trains and telegraphs compressed the world, while the microscope and telescope expanded it. In that turbulence, the myth of Hyperborea offered a counterweight: stillness. It was a vision of origin, of continuity in a world obsessed with progress. The more the Earth was measured, the more people longed for something immeasurable. Even in scientific circles, traces of the old idea persisted. The Arctic remained one of the least understood regions on the planet. Geologists studying glacial deposits discovered fossils of tropical plants and animals beneath the ice, proof that the poles had once been warm. To some, this seemed confirmation of the myth, a memory of Hyperborea encoded in stone. They speculated that Earth's axis had shifted, turning the former paradise into frozen desert. The notion of polar displacement entered both science and myth, blurring the boundary between them once again. In the 1920s and 1930s, the revival of Hyperborea took stranger turns. Certain fringe movements in Europe began to merge esotericism with nationalism, transforming myths of northern origins into ideological symbols. They claimed that the Aryan race had descended from the Hyperboreans, the ancient bearers of light. What had once been a metaphor for harmony became distorted into a justification for hierarchy. In these circles, the purity of the North was no longer spiritual, it was racial. The myth that once symbolized unity became a tool for division. That dark transformation showed how pliable the legend could be. Its power came from ambiguity, from being both everywhere and nowhere, both human and divine. Once anchored to politics, it lost its grace, but even in misuse it revealed its endurance. Few myths survive long enough to be corrupted. Hyperborea's persistence proved that it had tapped into something deeper than culture, the universal hunger for beginnings, the nostalgia for light. After the Second World War, when the world saw what ideology could do to imagination, scholars returned to the myth with renewed caution. Historians of religion, archaeologists and anthropologists began to re-examine the idea of the world axis and the symbolism of the North. They found versions of it in nearly every tradition. The Norse had their Yggdrasil, the cosmic tree that connected worlds. The Hindus had Mount Meru, the still centre of creation. The Greeks had their Hyperborea. All pointed to a shared intuition, that somewhere beyond the horizon lies a point of balance between heaven and earth. Writers of the mid-20th century rediscovered the myth's gentler meanings. The poet W.B. Yeats, influenced by theosophy and Irish mysticism, spoke of a land under wave and air, where time turned in circles. Mircea Eliade, the Romanian historian of religion, described Hyperborea as a symbol of primordial paradise, the polar centre from which all sacred geography radiated. For Eliade, the myth's endurance was proof that humanity could not live without orientation, Even in an age of maps and satellites, we still needed a north, a spiritual reference point to measure ourselves against. The fascination with the poles persisted in other ways. During the Cold War, both superpowers established bases in the Arctic, studying magnetism, weather, and the aurora. To the public, these remote outposts became new symbols of mystery, scientific yet secretive. Rumours flourished of underground facilities, hidden discoveries, and ancient relics beneath the ice. Fiction quickly absorbed them. Writers of speculative literature revived Hyperborea as a setting for otherworldly civilizations, advanced technologies, and forgotten gods. Clark Ashton Smith, in his strange and lyrical tales, imagined Hyperborea as an ancient realm swallowed by glaciers, its cities of green stone half buried in frost. H.P. Lovecraft borrowed the name too, weaving it into his mythos as a precursor to lost ages, a reminder that beneath the surface of modern life, pre-human memories still stirred. Even as these writers turned Hyperborea into cosmic horror or fantasy, the essence remained. The unreachable north, the land of light, the paradise before the fall. Each retelling reaffirmed the myth's adaptability. It could be sacred, scientific, mystical, or monstrous. It could embody enlightenment or despair, but it never ceased to attract those who sought meaning beyond the visible. In modern esoteric circles, the name still appears, whispered in theories that blend myth, archaeology, and speculative cosmology. Some link Hyperborea to shifting poles and lost continents. Others see it as a metaphor for consciousness itself, the inner north that points toward clarity. The myth has outlived every interpretation because it was never truly about geography. It was about direction, the movement from confusion toward stillness, from noise toward light. The revival of Hyperborea in esoteric thought is, in a sense, a mirror of our own era. The more information we possess, the more we feel the absence of meaning. Ancient myths, once dismissed as relics, return as coordinates for orientation. Hyperborea speaks to that need in quiet ways. It reminds us that knowledge and wonder were never enemies, and that the North, literal or symbolic, has always been the place where they meet. The occultists who drew circles in candlelight, the explorers who chased the aurora, the monks who copied lines of Greek verse, all were performing the same act, keeping the axis turning. Each added a layer to the story, a new shape to the map of the mind. Whether in secret societies or scientific academies, the longing was the same, to find the still point at the centre of the storm. Today, when we look at photographs of the Arctic from satellites, we see ice, water, and shadow. The black magnetic pole drifts across the map each year, indifferent to our myths. Yet somewhere behind those coordinates the old idea persists. The sense that there is a hidden order beneath the movement, a forgotten harmony waiting to be recognised. Hyperborea, as the ancients imagined it, may never have existed in space, but it exists everywhere as memory. And so the legend continues, not in temples or lodges, but in quiet reflection, the sense that perhaps we too are still searching for our own Hyperborea. Not the one of snow and light, but the one within. The place beyond fear, beyond noise, beyond the restless wind. And as that idea drifts through centuries of ink and belief, it carries us onward toward the next part of the story, when science itself would begin to circle the mystery once more, where the tools of measurement would turn back toward myth, and the frozen air would whisper the oldest question of all. What if a fragment of truth still lies beneath the ice? As the 20th century deepened, the world seemed to divide itself neatly between what could be measured and what could be imagined. Laboratories replaced temples, data replaced prophecy, and yet the boundary between the two was never quite solid. Even as science grew more confident, it could not silence the quiet rhythm of wonder that had carried myths like Hyperborea through millennia. The same questions that once moved priests and poets now stirred archaeologists, physicists, and dreamers. Where did humanity truly begin? What lies beneath the layers of time we have barely touched? And why do certain stories, like the one of a lost northern paradise, refuse to fade even in the age of satellites? In the early 20th century, archaeology was transforming from a gentleman's pursuit into a disciplined science. Excavations across Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Indus Valley uncovered civilizations older than anyone had imagined. Each new discovery seemed to push the dawn of history farther back, and yet, the more the ground yielded, the less final the story became. Beneath every ruin there seemed to be another. Beneath every civilization, another silence. This growing sense of deep time, vast and uneven, created fertile soil for both science and speculation. If cities could be buried under sand for 5,000 years, could entire continents not also vanish under ice? Geology offered a partial answer. By the 1920s, scientists were mapping ancient glaciations and continental drifts, reconstructing climates that had once turned tropical seas into deserts and forests into frozen plains. Fossils of palm trees and warm water shells were found in Arctic strata, proving that the poles had once known sunlight and warmth. To the scientific mind, this was a revelation about Earth's history. To those with mythic imagination, it was confirmation. The poles had once been different. The world had changed its posture. And in that shift, perhaps, lay the truth behind Hyperborea. The temptation to blend evidence with legend was strong. Authors on the fringes of academia began to suggest that myth was not mere invention, but the fragmented memory of prehistoric catastrophe. One of the first to explore this idea systematically was Bal Gangadhar Tilak, an Indian scholar and nationalist. In his 1903 work, The Arctic Home in the Vedas, Tilak proposed that the ancient hymns of India, rich with descriptions of long dawns, endless days and 6-month nights, preserved memories of an early Aryan homeland in the Arctic. He argued that the Rig Veda's poetic imagery was not symbolic but literal, describing natural phenomena only visible near the pole. According to him, before the last ice age, that region had been habitable, lush, and sacred. Tilak's theory, though speculative, captured the imagination of scholars and mystics alike. It suggested a bridge between myth and climatology, between poetry and paleogeography. If true, it would mean that humanity's earlier sacred stories began not under tropical suns, but beneath the endless twilight of polar skies. For some, this aligned beautifully with Greek accounts of Hyperborea, a northern Eden where gods mingled with men. Science, it seemed, was beginning to circle back toward myth. At the same time, another kind of investigation was underway, one less disciplined but far more seductive. In the 1930s and 1940s, as anthropology and early genetics attempted to classify humanity's origins, pseudo-historians began weaving grand narratives that blurred race, spirituality, and lost civilizations. They borrowed from theosophy and occult philosophy, but dressed their ideas in scientific language. Hyperborea, Atlantis, and Lemuria became not metaphors but supposed chapters in a literal prehistory, each representing vanished ages of humankind. The danger of this blending was subtle. Myths that once spoke of unity became used to divide. The notion that civilization had begun in the north was recast as proof of superiority, an argument for inherited wisdom rather than shared humanity. What had been a dream of harmony became a hierarchy. Science's aura of authority lent weight to fantasy, and the results were often disastrous. Ideologues of the mid-20th century appropriated the myth of Hyperborea to construct their own narratives of racial purity and cosmic destiny. In their hands, the land of eternal light became the homeland of chosen blood. It was an old myth wearing the armour of modernity, yet beyond those distortions, quieter voices persisted. Scientists and historians who sought to understand why humanity clung so fiercely to such legends. The Swiss psychologist Carl Jung offered one of the most enduring explanations. He proposed that myths like Hyperborea were archetypes, universal images that arose from the collective unconscious. They were not history, but human memory made symbolic. The polar paradise, in Jung's reading, represented the image of wholeness, the original state before fragmentation. It was not a place to be found, but a condition to be remembered. Jung's interpretation resonated deeply in a century that had seen both unprecedented discovery and unprecedented loss. As cities turned to ruins and empires collapsed, the image of an unreachable north, pure, silent, untarnished, offered comfort. The myth became psychological rather than physical, its geography internal. Hyperborea was the part of the human mind untouched by history's noise. But even as psychology claimed the myth, science continued to circle it. In the 1950s and 1960s, new technologies transformed the Arctic from legend into laboratory. Ice cores drilled from Greenland and Antarctica revealed climate cycles stretching back hundreds of thousands of years. Each layer of frozen water recorded the atmosphere of its time: dust, pollen, even ancient air. The findings confirmed what geology had long suspected. Earth's climate had shifted dramatically again and again. Entire ecosystems had flourished where now only ice remained. To the scientifically minded, this was evidence of natural change. To those still drawn to the old myths, it hinted at civilizations lost to those changes. Books blending science and speculation proliferated. Writers like Charles Hapgood proposed theories of Earth crust displacement, suggesting that the planet's outer shell could shift suddenly, moving continents to new latitudes. Hapgood's work, endorsed cautiously by figures like Albert Einstein, proposed that the Antarctic might once have been temperate, home to an advanced culture before being buried under ice. His 1958 book, Earth's Shifting Crust, reawakened public fascination with the idea of lost polar civilizations. Though his data was incomplete, his premise that Earth's surface could transform abruptly gave scientific language to what myths had always implied. Soon, the idea spread beyond academia into popular imagination. Magazine articles, radio programs, and early documentaries speculated about prehistoric cataclysms and ancient maps showing ice-free poles. The Piri Reis map, drawn in 1513 by an Ottoman admiral, became a focal point. It appeared to depict the coast of Antarctica centuries before its official discovery. Researchers debated its accuracy, arguing over whether it proved ancient global navigation or mere coincidence. Each theory, scientific or not, pulled Hyperborea back into conversation. By the late 20th century, the boundaries between science and pseudoscience had become more porous than ever. Television and print culture turned speculation into entertainment. Ancient astronaut theories, polar shifts, and lost continents filled shelves and screens. The Arctic and Antarctic, once the edges of the map, became blank canvases for imagination. The same longing that had driven Greek poets and Renaissance mapmakers found new expression in the age of mass media. To the skeptical mind, these were fabrications, misinterpretations of data and wishful thinking. Yet skepticism alone could not explain why people kept returning to them. The allure of the hidden past is not merely curiosity, it is identity. Myths like Hyperborea promise that humanity is older, wiser, and more connected than our fragmented history admits. They tell us that civilization did not emerge from chaos, but from a forgotten order. In that sense, pseudoscience often arises not from ignorance, but from yearning. The same yearning that built temples and observatories before telescopes existed. Even legitimate science carries traces of that same longing. Astrobiologists speak of panspermia, the idea that life on Earth might have come from beyond the planet, carried on comets or cosmic dust. Geneticists trace all human DNA to shared ancestors who lived in distant prehistory, scattered across shifting continents. Every discovery seems to push origin farther back, into deeper uncertainty. In the face of that vastness, myth remains the most human response, a story we can hold when data becomes too immense to comprehend. Hyperborea, as both myth and metaphor survives because it satisfies two contradictory needs: the need for explanation and the need for mystery. It gives shape to the unknown without closing it. Science advances by answering questions, but imagination endures by keeping them open. Between the two lies a dialogue that has defined human thought since the beginning, the conversation between what we can measure and what we can only feel. The Arctic, now mapped by satellites and probed by drones, still evokes that dialogue. Scientists there measure atmospheric gases and magnetic drift, but many describe the experience of being in such stillness as transformative. They speak of the silence that absorbs sound, of light that never settles into day or night. The physical north continues to mirror the mythical one, a place where perception itself bends. Even surrounded by data, they find themselves haunted by the same impression that touched the ancient Greeks, that the top of the world is not simply location, but condition. Modern researchers studying polar magnetism note that the magnetic poles wander unpredictably, sometimes shifting hundreds of kilometres in a decade. The cause remains partly mysterious, linked to currents within Earth's molten core. To some, this moving axis is another echo of the mythic centre, the living heart that never stays fixed, reminding us that stability is an illusion. The compass still trembles, just as it did in the hands of sailors centuries ago. Meanwhile, archaeologists continue to unearth traces of lost climates and migrations. Beneath Siberian permafrost lie mammoths, ancient human tools and fossils from warmer eras. The evidence of transformation is everywhere. Each layer of Earth holds a memory of a world that once was, a reminder that our planet has forgotten more than it remembers. The line between myth and science blurs again, not because science has failed, but because the truth is too vast for one language alone. Pseudoscience thrives in that blur. Books and digital documentaries speak of pyramids under Arctic ice, of civilizations older than recorded time, of maps drawn by beings more advanced than us. They borrow fragments of geology, astronomy and history, weaving them into intricate patterns of suggestion. Though often unverifiable, they fulfill an emotional need that pure data cannot. They give narrative to the chaos of evidence. They transform random fossils into memory, cold measurements into destiny. It is easy to dismiss such theories, but harder to ignore the impulse behind them. The same curiosity that drives pseudoscience drives real science. The difference lies in method, not motivation. Both arise from the same question: what came before us? And both are drawn to the same symbols: light, north, beginnings. Hyperborea endures as the meeting point between them, a myth so adaptable it can survive in both equations and incantations. As the 21st century unfolds, our instruments grow more precise, our satellites more observant, but the myth continues to shadow the data. When climate scientists describe melting glaciers revealing ancient forests, they use language that sounds almost mythic. The Earth, they say, is remembering. Ice is not destruction, it is preservation. In that frozen silence, time folds back on itself, and for a brief moment, we see the world as it once was. Hyperborea, whether real or imagined, has always been about that moment, the revelation that the past is not gone but sleeping. The line between science and myth softens there. The rationalist and the dreamer both stand before the same horizon of ice and light, humbled by how little we truly know. And so, the story continues, passing quietly from laboratory to legend, from journal to whisper, from data point to dream. The temptation of the hidden past remains, not as delusion but as the most enduring proof of our nature. We are creatures who seek origin. We are wanderers who never stop looking north. And beyond that still horizon, where the white light merges with the sky, another chapter of the story waits, when art and philosophy will join the search once more, and the image of Hyperborea will return, not as evidence, but as reflection, shimmering again in the modern mind like the faint aurora of the forgotten dawn. Every era that inherits an old myth eventually tries to test it. Once the tools of divination gave way to instruments of science, humanity began to look for confirmation in the most unlikely places, inside bloodlines, in layers of ice, in the chemical fingerprints of the planet itself. It was inevitable that the story of Hyperborea would drift into those same frontiers. For a legend born from the idea of eternal light and timelessness, the 20th and 21st centuries offered a strange kind of resurrection. We could now peer into time, almost literally, through the frozen breath of ages and the coded echoes of our own DNA. When the first ice cores were drilled from Greenland in the mid-20th century, scientists realised they were holding a chronicle older than civilization. Each layer, faintly coloured and thin as paper, preserved a year of snowfall, compacted into crystal memory. Dust, ash, trapped bubbles of air, all became tiny witnesses to worlds long vanished. By measuring the gases within those bubbles, scientists could reconstruct temperatures, storms, volcanic eruptions, even cosmic radiation levels going back hundreds of thousands of years. What they found confirmed what myth had only suggested. The Earth had changed dramatically again and again. There were times when the poles had been warm enough for forests, periods when the Arctic Ocean may have been ice-free. Evidence showed tropical species fossilised in regions now buried beneath glaciers. To science, this revealed the dynamism of the planet. To those who remembered the whispers of Hyperborea, it felt like vindication. The idea that a temperate northern paradise might once have existed no longer belonged solely to legend. It was, at least in part, geologically plausible, yet science, patient and careful, speaks in degrees, not absolutes. The warming of polar regions tens of millions of years ago predated humanity itself. There were no marble cities under that ancient sun, no gods walking through tundra turned to meadow. Still, the correspondence between mythic imagery and climatic evidence stirred fascination. How had the ancients intuited something that modern data now confirmed, that the world was not static, that climates could invert, that paradise and desolation could trade places across epochs? The deeper researchers drilled, the more nuanced the story became. Ice cores from Antarctica, reaching back nearly 1 million years, revealed a rhythm of glaciations, cycles of ice advancing and retreating like breath. Each pulse reshaped the face of continents, altered sea levels, and changed migration routes. Some scientists began to suspect that these cycles might have imprinted themselves on the collective memory of early humanity. If prehistoric groups witnessed the onset or end of an ice age, their descendants might have carried those impressions through oral traditions, eventually reshaping them into myths of lost golden ages, floods and lands swallowed by cold. In that sense, Hyperborea could represent a cultural memory, an inherited echo of warmth fading into frost. Anthropology supports this possibility in subtle ways. Across different cultures, there are myths of lands that once existed in the far north or far south, destroyed or hidden when the world changed. The Inuit speak of a time when the ice came suddenly. Norse legends describe a primordial warmth before the frost giant Ymir was slain. Siberian tales recall migrations forced by snow that never stopped falling. In each of these stories there is a sense of loss, a memory of a gentler climate, a time when life was easier and the sun lingered longer. These fragments, scattered across cultures and languages, could be the residue of ancient human adaptation to changing worlds. In recent decades, genetic science has added new layers to this quiet puzzle. The sequencing of human DNA and the reconstruction of migration patterns have revealed that our species has survived multiple climatic crises. Around 70,000 years ago, a volcanic eruption at Mount Toba in Indonesia nearly drove humanity to extinction. Small groups of survivors, perhaps only a few thousand individuals, spread outward, carrying with them genetic lineages that would populate the planet. Those lineages trace paths north and east, into Siberia, across Beringia and beyond. Some researchers studying ancient genomes from northern Eurasia have found surprising connections between populations separated by great distances. DNA recovered from remains in Siberia, dating to nearly 24,000 years ago, shows genetic links to both early Europeans and Native Americans. This discovery, often referred to as the Malta-Boy genome, revealed that the peopling of the world's northern regions was far more complex than once believed. It suggested waves of migration through climates that modern humans would find uninhabitable, regions that may have seemed, at times, almost temperate compared to today. To those still enchanted by the myth, these discoveries sparked a familiar thought. What if some memory of those ancient migrations, the journeys across shining ice and open tundra, lingered as the seed of the Hyperborean story? The Greeks might have inherited distant rumours of northern tribes, descriptions distorted by time but rooted in truth. After all, trade and contact across Eurasia stretched back thousands of years. The stories of lands where the sun never set could easily have filtered southward, carried by merchants, travellers and wandering storytellers. In this sense, Hyperborea might be less a fantasy than a poetic echo of real human movement across climates we can scarcely imagine. But science rarely stays content with echoes. It looks for tangible signs. As genetic analysis expanded into environmental DNA, the microscopic traces of life preserved in soil, sediment and ice. Researchers began to uncover ancient ecosystems layer by layer. Samples from Greenland's frozen ground revealed that 2 million years ago, the region had been covered not by ice but by boreal forests. DNA fragments showed traces of poplar trees, hares, mastodons, even geese. The Arctic, it turned out, had once been green. Such discoveries invite both wonder and caution. They prove that warmth and life once thrived where now there is silence. But they also remind us of the scale of time involved. The Hyperboreans, if they ever existed as a people, could not have walked among mastodons. Yet myth does not obey timelines. It gathers impressions. The green Arctic of deep prehistory, the tundra plains of the Ice Age, the migrations of early humans, all could merge in collective imagination into a single, luminous north. The study of ancient DNA from ice cores has also revealed something almost poetic, that air itself remembers. Trapped bubbles preserve ancient atmospheres, showing fluctuations in carbon dioxide, oxygen, and even traces of pollen and spores carried by forgotten winds. In a way, the ice is a kind of manuscript, each layer a page written in temperature and dust. When scientists extract and read those layers, they perform an act not so different from the medieval scribes who copied myths of Hyperborea. Both are efforts to preserve what time would otherwise erase. The connection between the physical record and the mythic imagination becomes even more intriguing when we consider how both science and legend describe transitions. Myths of golden ages often end with catastrophe, a flood, a freeze, or a fall from grace. Ice cores tell similar stories in colder language, abrupt temperature drops, spikes in volcanic ash, the signature of extinction. The pattern repeats. Harmony gives way to imbalance, abundance to scarcity, warmth to cold. Whether one calls it divine punishment or orbital mechanics, the rhythm is the same. In that repetition, some scientists and historians of myth see a common thread. They suggest that legends like Hyperborea may encode human experience of cyclical change, the oscillation between stability and upheaval that defines both climate and culture. The memory of a lost paradise could simply be the human expression of longing for balance in a world that constantly shifts beneath our feet. Modern climatology, ironically, brings us closer to the ancient worldview than we might expect. The ancients saw the earth as alive, its moods reflected in wind and sea. Today, scientists describe the planet as a self-regulating system. The Gaia hypothesis, proposed by James Lovelock, sees Earth as a living organism maintaining equilibrium through feedback loops of atmosphere, ocean and biosphere. The language may differ, but the intuition is the same. The Earth breathes, remembers, and reacts, and the polar regions in particular act as its lungs, exhaling cold into the rest of the world. If one listens closely, the myth of Hyperborea is a story about that very heartbeat, the interplay of light, warmth, and the fragility of order. As satellite imaging advanced, revealing the fine structure of polar ice and the sediments beneath it, new mysteries emerged. Radar mapping uncovered patterns in the subglacial landscape, valleys, ridges, and, in rare cases, what appeared to be ancient river systems buried miles under ice. Some enthusiasts seized upon these findings as proof of lost civilizations, arguing that the shapes might mark the remains of human construction. Scientists, more cautious, attributed them to geology, erosion, volcanic activity, and the pressure of moving glaciers. Yet even within sober research, one cannot help noticing the familiarity of the image, a hidden world preserved in white silence, waiting for light. The fascination extends beyond the poles. Genetic studies of isolated populations in northern Eurasia, Greenland, and the Arctic Circle have revealed surprising continuity. Some groups carry genetic markers suggesting their ancestors lived in extreme northern conditions for tens of thousands of years. Their languages preserve metaphors of light, wind, and endurance. Oral traditions describe migrations following stars that never set, or rivers that disappeared under snow. Though separated by millennia, their stories retain echoes of an origin intimately tied to the rhythms of the Arctic. In that context, Hyperborea begins to look less like a misplaced continent, and more like a composite memory of human persistence. The myth may not describe a single civilization, but rather a state of existence, a way of life adapted to cycles of light and darkness, survival and renewal. It is possible that fragments of these early Arctic cultures filtered southward through generations, evolving into the poetic accounts that reached Greece. To those who lived far from the polar horizon, such stories of endless day must have sounded like visions of divinity. As research continues, the scientific and the symbolic grow harder to separate. Ice cores, genetic maps, and mythic texts all tell stories about continuity and loss, about the fragility of warmth and the endurance of memory. Each discipline, in its own way, seeks Hyperborea, not as a place, but as a moment when humanity and nature moved in harmony. The newest discoveries from Greenland's frozen soil have pushed the boundaries of time further still. In 2022, scientists confirmed the presence of DNA from a 2-million-year-old ecosystem, the oldest genetic material ever recovered. It preserved a portrait of a world that no longer exists, a warm, forested Arctic alive with creatures now extinct. For a brief time, the North had been paradise again. The resemblance to the ancient descriptions is uncanny, though separated by epochs no myth could measure. Yet when researchers describe that world, their language sometimes turns almost lyrical. They speak of sunlight falling on birch trees, of rivers winding through valleys long since entombed in ice. In those words, the scientist and the poet meet. Perhaps that is where Hyperborea truly survives, in the quiet overlap between fact and feeling. The myth endures because it offers a framework for awe. It tells us that even when knowledge expands, mystery remains. The deeper we look into the Earth's frozen heart, the more we sense how thin the line is between imagination and memory. The ice still holds secrets. Deep beneath Greenland's glaciers lie sediments older than recorded history, and within those sediments, the chemical ghosts of climates that shaped early life. Each core extracted brings us closer not only to understanding the planet's past, but to glimpsing the continuity that myth once expressed through story. Science may not find the Hyperboreans themselves, but it has already found their landscape, the warmth beneath the frost, the rhythm of light and dark that defined every living thing. And so the search continues, not with compasses now, but with centrifuges and sequencers. Laboratories replace temples, Yet the impulse is the same: to touch the beginning, to read the oldest record, to listen for the hum beneath the silence. In each layer of ice, in each spiral of DNA, there is the faint whisper of the same truth that carried through ancient verse, that the world remembers more than it reveals. And as the drills turn deeper, as computers translate molecular patterns into history, the myth continues to glow quietly at the edges of the delta. Hyperborea, whatever it was, still waits somewhere between belief and evidence, an idea too persistent to vanish, too human to prove. And beyond that frost-bound memory, the story drifts toward its next horizon, where human imagination begins to rebuild the legend in art and philosophy once more, where the eternal light that the ancients once dreamed of will return, not as geography, but as metaphor reborn for the modern age. Every civilization, at some point in its life, invents a memory of perfection. It might call it Eden, Elysium, Shambhala, or Hyperborea, but the pattern is the same. A golden age sits at the beginning of time, untouched by the noise of history. It is a story that seems to exist everywhere, on tablets buried under Mesopotamian dust, in hymns sung along the Ganges, in the verses of Greek poets, and the myths of the far north. The details differ, yet the emotional shape remains constant. The belief that once, long ago, the world was whole. That belief has nothing to do with geography. It is psychological. Beneath every myth of a lost world lies a human need that science can measure but not erase. The longing for coherence, for the feeling that existence once made perfect sense. In that way, the myth of Hyperborea is not only about the north or the light, it is about memory itself, about the strange way the mind rearranges the past into patterns of harmony. Psychologists who study cultural myth-making often describe it as a form of collective autobiography. Societies remember themselves through stories, just as individuals do. The mind, faced with disorders, instinctively builds a narrative that restores meaning. Myths of paradise are, in this sense, the psyche's attempt to repair the dissonance of time. They give us a starting point, an origin against which we can measure decline. Without that imagined perfection, the present feels adrift. When ancient poets spoke of Hyperborea, they were not just describing a place, they were describing the idea of timelessness, a state before change began. The sun that never set, the wind that never bit, the people who never aged, all of it expressed an intuitive desire to escape entropy. The human brain, wired to detect loss and decay, compensates by creating counter-images of eternity. Paradise is the mind's answer to impermanence. Carl Jung recognized this instinct as universal. He called it the archetype of the lost unity, a symbol recurring in dreams, religions, and myths across cultures. It represents not simply nostalgia, but the deep wish to return to the undivided state of childhood, or even of consciousness before self-awareness. In myth, that state becomes an external landscape, a garden, a city, a northern paradise. The longing for Hyperborea is, at its core, the longing to be free of contradiction, to be whole before we learned what fragmentation meant. Sigmund Freud, in his own way, reached similar ground when he wrote about the oceanic feeling, a sense of boundless connection that he identified as the foundation of religious sentiment. For Freud, it was the residue of early infancy, when the self was not yet separate from the world. Myths of golden ages, he thought, were projections of that lost unity onto the canvas of time. The ancient paradise was, psychologically speaking, the mind's memory of undivided being. Modern neuroscience supports this idea in quieter ways. Studies of memory show that recollection is never static. It is a reconstruction, shaped by emotion and desire. The more we idealize the past, the more the brain edits it. Golden ages are not lies. They are the brain's way of giving shape to longing. On a collective scale, entire cultures perform the same act of editing. They remember what comforts and forget what wounds. In that process, history slowly turns into myth. The myth of Hyperborea, therefore, tells us more about the human condition than about geography. Its persistence across time shows that the need for origins is inseparable from the need for hope. When people imagine a perfect past, they are not simply yearning for lost beauty. They are protecting themselves from despair. To believe that perfection once existed is to believe it can exist again. The Golden Age is always both memory and promise. In times of crisis, these stories become especially powerful. During war, famine, or environmental collapse, societies reach backward toward their myths of wholeness, drawing strength from the idea that harmony once ruled. Historians of culture call this pattern the regression to origin. It appears again and again during the fall of Rome, the Black Death, the Industrial Revolution. Each time humanity feels disoriented by change, it rebuilds the memory of a world that made sense. The Greeks did it through Hyperborea, the Hebrews through Eden, the Chinese through the age of the Yellow Emperor. Even in the modern era, the pattern repeats in subtler forms. The yearning for a simpler, purer past, whether in politics, philosophy, or personal nostalgia, follows the same emotional architecture as the myth of paradise. It is the hope that somewhere, behind all this complexity, there was once clarity. Philosophers have tried to name that impulse. Friedrich Nietzsche saw it as the shadow side of progress, a refusal to accept the creative power of imperfection. To him, the myth of a lost golden age was a way for humanity to escape responsibility for the present. If we believe that the best time was behind us, we no longer need to build it. But others, like Mircea Eliade, saw the same impulse as sacred rather than regressive. Eliade wrote that the longing for beginnings was not denial, but renewal, the attempt to reconnect with the moment when the world was first made meaningful. In his view, rituals, myths, and even scientific inquiry were all forms of repetition, attempts to return to the centre of creation. Eliade's interpretation fits Hyperborea perfectly. The legend was never only about escape, it was about return. The Greeks did not dream of reaching the north as wanderers. They imagined it as the homecoming of the divine. Apollo did not flee to Hyperborea, he went there to renew himself, to regain balance before returning to the world. That rhythm, departure and return, mirrors the psychological cycle of loss and recovery. It is the same rhythm that defines human life, moving away from innocence, seeking knowledge, then longing to find innocence again, with understanding intact. From a psychological standpoint, Hyperborea symbolizes the state of mind where opposites reconcile, the meeting point of reason and wonder, knowledge and peace. Every generation reinterprets it through its own anxieties. The ancients saw it as a paradise of gods. The Renaissance made it a symbol of hidden wisdom. The Romantics turned it into the mirror of the soul. Today, in an age of uncertainty and digital acceleration, Hyperborea quietly reappears in our fascination with lost knowledge, unspoiled nature, and distant simplicity. We still speak of getting back to balance, to authenticity, to what was once whole. It is the same journey, translated into modern idiom. Anthropologists studying myth as adaptive behaviour note that these stories serve a practical psychological function. They provide continuity. In a world that constantly changes, the idea of a fixed point, a perfect past or a sacred centre, gives orientation. It allows individuals and societies to endure chaos without losing identity. The concept of Hyperborea, even when treated as metaphor, fulfills that need. It offers a northern compass for the psyche, a symbolic place where clarity survives. The recurring imagery of light in the myth, sun that never sets, sky that never darkens, fits this pattern. Light has always represented awareness, stability, the triumph of comprehension over confusion. A land of eternal day is a mind without shadow, a consciousness free from fear. That vision appeals because it contrasts so sharply with daily experience. Life, by nature, alternates between light and dark, joy and loss. The myth of constant illumination promises release from that cycle. It is a fantasy of calm in a world built on motion. Yet psychologists caution that such longing, if left unchecked, can become escapism. The myth of the Golden Age is both medicine and mirage. It soothes by giving shape to longing, but it can also paralyze by idealizing what can never return. When belief hardens into literalism, when paradise becomes a place rather than a state, the imagination that created it begins to imprison its believers. History is filled with examples of movements that sought to recreate a lost perfection and instead unleashed ruin. Myths of the past, once meant to heal, can become tools of control when confused with fact. Understanding this duality is key to understanding why Hyperborea endures without proof. It survives not because it is true, but because it is useful. It gives voice to the inarticulate ache that modern life cannot cure, the sense that something essential has been forgotten. Its function is emotional rather than factual, and in that sense it remains necessary. Contemporary psychology describes this phenomenon as existential nostalgia, the yearning not for a specific time, but for a quality of being that feels lost. People describe it as homesickness for something they never personally experienced. It is the same feeling evoked by ruins, by old music, by the sight of untouched landscapes. Hyperborea exists at the intersection of that nostalgia and hope. It is the imagined home we have never visited but which feels familiar the moment we hear its name. Artists, philosophers and mystics have long understood this emotional geography. They recreate it in different forms, the painter searching for the perfect light, the writer describing a vanished childhood, the philosopher seeking first principles. Each is pursuing a version of the same horizon, the unreachable point where complexity dissolves into simplicity, where the noise of history falls silent. Hyperborea, for them, is not myth but method, a way of thinking that restores harmony. Even modern psychology acknowledges that such myths can heal. Narrative therapy, for instance, encourages individuals to rewrite their personal stories, transforming chaos into coherence. On a collective scale, cultural myths perform the same function. They help societies integrate trauma, frame loss, and recover meaning. The story of a lost paradise becomes a symbolic rehearsal for renewal. By imagining a beginning, we make rebirth possible. Perhaps that is why Hyperborea, despite centuries of reinterpretation, never truly fades. It speaks to the mind's deepest rhythm, the need to believe that beneath ruin lies order, that beneath forgetting lies memory. The Greeks placed it beyond the north wind, but psychologically it lies beneath consciousness, in the part of the human soul that remembers light even in darkness. And when science, philosophy and art circle the same theme, they're all answering the same quiet question: what have we lost that makes us human? Myths like Hyperborea do not answer it directly. They simply hold the space where the question can breathe. They remind us that longing itself is proof of awareness. The mind dreams of wholeness because it knows what it means to be broken. So we keep the myth alive, not to escape the present, but to illuminate it. We trace its outlines across psychology, history and imagination, knowing that each interpretation is another reflection of ourselves. The Golden Age endures because the search for meaning never ends. Every new discovery, every technological leap, every quiet night spent looking northward repeats the same motion, the reaching out toward what feels pure, calm and whole. And somewhere beyond that motion, beyond the mind's horizon, the story continues. It shifts from psychology to art, from the language of thought to the language of image, where painters, writers and dreamers will keep chasing the same light the ancients described. An unending glow that belongs not to the sky, but to the imagination that never stops trying to rebuild paradise from memory. When one stands beneath the polar sky and watches the aurora unfold, the air itself seems to breathe. The lights move slowly as if carried by unseen hands, curtains of green, ribbons of violet, streaks of pale gold that ripple without sound. They appear and vanish, drift and reappear, never still, never the same. To the ancient imagination, this spectacle was not merely weather, it was a visitation. The heavens were opening briefly to reveal the world behind the world, and even now, with satellites measuring every fluctuation of solar wind, the feeling remains the same. The lights remind us that knowledge and mystery can coexist. They show us that wonder was never abolished by understanding, it simply learned to speak a quieter language. The myth of Hyperborea belongs to that same silence. It survives not in the details of its geography, but in the pattern of thought it represents. Every generation projects its own meaning onto it. For the Greeks, it was perfection beyond the wind. For the medieval monks, it was Eden preserved beneath snow. For the explorers, it was an undiscovered continent. For mystics and scholars, it became a mirror of the soul. What endures through all these transformations is not the idea of a lost place, but the habit of looking northward, the psychological gesture of turning toward what lies beyond certainty. Standing under the northern lights, one senses that habit in the body, the instinct to lift the eyes upward, to trace the shifting arcs of colour, to imagine a design behind their motion. It is the same motion of thought that first produced myth. The mind, faced with vastness, reaches for meaning. It cannot help but see connection in motion, harmony in change. Hyperborea, at its core, is that reflex made permanent, the moment of awe frozen into story. The human brain is built for pattern. It seeks order even in chaos, continuity even in randomness. Evolution favoured the minds that could interpret uncertainty as possibility. That instinct, though ancient, is still active every time we witness the unknown. When the Greeks felt the cold wind of Boreas sweeping down the mountains, they did not simply endure it, they personified it. They gave the invisible form and name. When they imagined a realm beyond his reach, they were doing what all humans do when faced with limits. They imagined more. Hyperborea is the oldest gesture of the creative mind, the refusal to stop where knowledge ends. That refusal is not ignorance, it is the foundation of inquiry. The same curiosity that made the ancients invent gods, made scientists build telescopes. The shape of wonder has changed, but its essence has not. The myth of Hyperborea, when stripped of its ancient geography, reveals something timeless about human nature. The need to believe that perfection is not gone, only hidden. We look outward because we cannot bear the idea that meaning ends at the edge of what we can prove. The northern lights themselves are a fitting symbol for that belief. They are born from collision, the meeting of solar wind and magnetic field, energy and resistance. Their beauty arises from friction. The myth of Hyperborea works the same way. It is the meeting of knowledge and yearning, fact and imagination. It glows brightest where those forces touch. The Greeks might not have known the science of plasma or magnetism, but they understood its emotion. The light beyond Boreas was the colour of understanding meeting mystery. Philosophers of the Enlightenment centuries later found in that image an echo of their own struggle. They sought to replace myth with reason, yet in their pursuit of order, they discovered that the unknown grew larger, not smaller. The more they mapped, the more mystery expanded. To look north became once again an act of faith, not in gods, but in the inexhaustibility of truth. Even the modern scientist, peering through instruments at data streaming from the poles, participates in the same lineage of seekers. Every measurement is an offering to the same quiet question: what lies beyond what we can see? The persistence of Hyperborea in human thought suggests that this question is not one we can, or should, erase. Myth, psychology, and science are not enemies. They are layers of the same desire to articulate awe. When ancient stories speak of the North as the realm of eternal day, they are describing what the intellect feels when it glimpses coherence, a world without night, without interruption, where everything connects. It is not a literal light, but an inner one, the illumination of understanding. Artists have always understood this better than most. They translate the myth not into doctrine, but into vision. Caspar David Friedrich's Arctic landscapes, with their pale light and frozen ships, are not illustrations of despair. They are meditations on stillness, on the beauty of limits. The same emotional current runs through the music of Jean Sibelius, whose symphonies seem carved from frost and silence. Each note feels like the sound of light itself, melancholy, endless, northern. These works do not explain Hyperborea, they enact it. They turn longing into structure, nostalgia into harmony. Philosophers too have returned to the myth, though often unconsciously. In Martin Heidegger's writing about being, there is a subtle echo of the Hyperborean impulse, the search for the origin that still underlies existence. He called it the clearing, a place where truth reveals itself as both presence and concealment. That description might as well apply to the mythic north, a space where light exists precisely because shadow surrounds it. The essence of Hyperborea is not the absence of darkness, but its balance. The knowledge that clarity only matters when it is fragile. Psychologists find the same pattern in the human mind. The moments when people feel most alive often occur at the threshold between safety and uncertainty, between comprehension and awe. The brain releases dopamine not when it finds answers, but when it anticipates them. Wonder, biologically speaking, is the pleasure of approach. The myth of a perfect land just beyond reach embodies that neural truth. It is the psychological equivalent of the horizon, always receding, always guiding. This is why myths of paradise rarely describe the present. The present is too close, too cluttered with noise and imperfection. The golden age must always be elsewhere, because elsewhere is what keeps us moving. Hyperborea, by existing just beyond the wind, kept Greek imagination alive. It gave poets and philosophers a direction for thought. Even now, in a world mapped by satellites and dissected by data, we need our own versions of that unreachable north. Ideas that remind us that discovery never ends. The aurora's colours, those shifting greens and violets, are caused by atoms excited by solar energy, electrons colliding with the upper atmosphere. Yet the physics does not diminish the beauty. Knowing how it works makes it no less hypnotic. The same is true of myth. Understanding Hyperborea as psychology, metaphor, or cultural memory does not kill its power. It clarifies it. The myth becomes not a lie, but a mirror. It shows us that the urge to find meaning is itself the source of meaning. Even the language of modern science, for all its precision, carries echoes of mythic tone. When physicists describe dark matter or the birth of stars, their vocabulary often slips into poetry. Fields, symmetry, creation, decay. The further knowledge reaches, the more it resembles myth's rhythm, a story about beginnings, endings, and balance. The difference is not one of purpose, only of syntax. Both are expressions of awe told in the grammar of their time. The persistence of Hyperborea into the present suggests something comforting about human continuity. We change tools, not instincts. The ancient North was a metaphor for purity. The modern North, measured in data and climate graphs, still holds that same aura. We look to it for truth about the planet, about change, about survival. The scientists drilling ice cores today perform a ritual older than they realise. They are listening to the world remember itself. The instruments hum softly, and the frozen air rises like incense, whispering of warmth that once was. That act, turning silence into information, is the modern form of prayer. When one reads the oldest accounts of the Hyperboreans, their simplicity feels almost intimate. They lived without toil, said the poets. They grew old without pain. They sang to the sun which never left them. Such details are not history, they are wishes projected outward. They describe the peace the human mind keeps searching for, generation after generation. Each age defines its own Boreas, its own boundary of noise and dreams of a light beyond it. For the Greeks, it was the literal wind. For us, it is the weight of time, the speed of life, the constant vibration of information. Our Hyperborea is still the same dream, a place where silence remains unbroken and meaning endures. The northern lights, viewed from the frozen plains, reveal this truth without words. They are beauty that asks for nothing, motion without purpose. They appear and vanish, reminding us that transience and eternity are not opposites but reflections. The Hyperboreans, if they ever existed, were said to live in balance with such cycles. Their myth survives because it teaches balance, not escape. It tells us that paradise is not the refusal of change, but harmony with it. In that sense, the myth of Hyperborea was never wrong. It was simply misread. The paradise it described was not a point on the map, but a perspective. It was the way the world looks when fear dissolves, when cold becomes clarity, when distance becomes invitation. The land beyond Boreas was never about geography. It was about perception beyond dread. When explorers sailed north into the unknown, when monks copied ancient verses, when scientists drilled ice in silence, each was performing the same gesture, moving toward the light they could not possess but could still follow. That movement is what defines humanity. We are creatures of pursuit, defined not by arrival but by orientation. The myth endures because it encodes that truth. So when we speak of Hyperborea today, in quiet rooms lit by screens or beneath skies glowing with electromagnetic colour, we are still whispering the same question that began it all. Can harmony survive change? Can wonder coexist with knowledge? Can light last? The answers shift like the aurora, visible, intangible, always in motion, but the act of asking is enough. In the stillness of the Arctic night, when air seems older than time and the sky glows faintly at its edges, the human presence feels small but not meaningless. The lights dance, the compass trembles, the earth hums softly underfoot. Somewhere within that quiet vibration, the myth of Hyperborea lives, not as a story about gods, but as a reflection of ourselves, of our need to see beauty in the distance and still believe it is connected to us. Perhaps that is what the ancients truly meant when they spoke of the land beyond the north wind. It was not escape, not even discovery, it was recognition. To look toward Hyperborea is to remember that awe is not weakness. It is the measure of being awake in a vast and living world. And as the aurora fades and the stars settle back into silence, the imagination remains suspended between what is known and what still shimmers just beyond reach. The myth waits there, patient as ice, alive as light, reminding us quietly that we have never stopped standing at the edge of the world, gazing northward and wondering what remains beyond the wind.